BMZ dabei ein besonderes Anliegen. Dort, wo die Wälder bereits verloren gegangen sind und eine Welt ohne Wald ist undenkbar. Wälder sind die Lungen der Erde und regulieren das Weltklima. Sie gehören zu den wichtigsten Ökosystemen unseres Planeten und sind Horte bedeutender biologischer Vielfalt. Schätzungen zufolge ist ca. ein Drittel der Menschheit zur Überlebenssicherung auf Wälder und ihre Rohstoffe angewiesen. Doch mehr denn je sind die Wälder gefährdet. Alleine in den letzten 3 Jahrzehnten gingen weltweit 420 Millionen Hektar Wald verloren. Das entspricht ungefähr der Fläche der Europäischen Union. Besonders dramatisch sind die Verluste der artenreichen Tropenwälder in Afrika, Asien und Lateinamerika. Die Folgen davon sind schon heute deutlich erkennbar. Stürme, Überschwemmungen und Dürren nehmen weltweit zu. Ökosysteme geraten durcheinander, Wildtiere verlieren ihre Lebensräume, kommen in Kontakt zu Menschen und können Viren übertragen. Um die wachsende Weltbevölkerung zu ernähren, müssen die landwirtschaftlichen Erträge in den kommenden Jahren um ein Vielfaches erhöht werden. Damit wird der Druck auf die Wälder weiter steigen. Landwirtschaft trägt wesentlich zur Entwaldung bei. Wo einst tropische Wälder standen, wachsen heute Agrarrohstoffe wie Soja oder Palmöl. Insbesondere für den Konsum in Asien, aber auch bei uns in Europa. Wir müssen also handeln. Die deutsche Bundesregierung hat sich verpflichtet, zusammen mit der internationalen Gemeinschaft Waldverluste zu stoppen und bis 2030 etwa 350 Millionen Hektar Wald wiederherzustellen. Das BMZ setzt vor allem auf Ansätze, die Waldschutz und nachhaltige Waldnutzung in Einklang bringen. Die Stärkung der Rechte von Frauen, indigenen Gruppen und lokalen Gemeinden ist dem BMZ dabei ein besonderes Anliegen. Dort, wo die Wälder bereits verloren gegangen sind, unterstützt das BMZ seine Partnerländer, Wälder und baumreiche Landschaften nachhaltig wiederherzustellen. Zudem unterstützt Deutschland Partnerländer und Unternehmen beim Aufbau von entwaldungsfreien Lieferketten und tritt ein für die Einführung ambitionierter EU-Gesetze zu entwaldungsfreien Lieferketten sowie unternehmerischen Sorgfaltspflichten für Umweltschutz und Menschenrechte. Doch es gibt noch viel mehr zu tun. Wir müssen die Waldgovernance verbessern und vor allem den Tropenwäldern muss endlich der Anteil der Klimagelder zukommen, der ihrem Potenzial entspricht. Wir brauchen einen fairen Deal.
Guests, a warm welcome to you. I'm delighted to see you all here. Also a warm welcome to our audience who is joining us virtually to this Tropical Forest Symposium of 2021 here in Berlin. Ministers present from different Central African countries, guests. I am pleased to welcome you here at the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And you can see it on the map behind me, and you also just heard it in the video. We are talking today about a very important and special climate zone, because the tropical forests are our green lungs on our blue planet. This is something that we're going to be talking about today. A world without these forests is inconceivable, as they are one of the most important ecosystems on our planet. And our Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development said yesterday, forests are life and rainforests are life. This is what he said yesterday at the Congo Basin Forest Day. And of course, there are several questions that we couldn't deal with yesterday, so we hope to touch upon them today. But there are other questions, of course, we will be focusing on today. How can we together, in the interest of mankind and with the view to the current loss of large areas of forests, cooperate better to conserve tropical forests better? What does a fair deal consist of? between tropical forest countries and the rest of the international community in order to make sure that common efforts actually become effective and therefore strengthen the protection of tropical forests. What is the responsibility of the international community to support tropical forest countries also in this very difficult and challenging task of conserving forests? And which approaches are there to protect forests? How can we, the forest countries, civil society, donors, private business, researchers, all join forces in order to make sure that our fantastic tropical forests that they are faring better, so that we can secure our green lungs. And if we talk about trade, then we also have to talk about supply chains. How can consumer countries stop the import of deforestation? So these were some of the questions we would like to touch upon. We will try to find solutions to them. And yesterday we just signed a declaration that linked everybody who's active in the Congo Basin Forest Partnership. I would like to welcome you today. My name is Katie Gallis. I'm your facilitator and host today. And I'm delighted to have you all here. May it be present here at the Federal Ministry or online. Everybody who's here is either tested, vaccinated, or has recovered from a COVID infection. So we are sticking to the rules that apply for such meetings. And for our guests who are joining us online, although you're not here yourself, you have the opportunity to ask your questions, because there is a chat box below the live stream, and we look forward to seeing your questions. And I look forward to reading from you, and please indicate your name and the institution you work for. So much so far, and I would like to ask to the stage to me Mr. Krake, Director General in the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you here on behalf of the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the BMZ. I would say that the Tropical Forest Symposium comes just in time. This is a good moment to have these conferences before the big COPs that are upcoming. And we know how important these questions relating to biodiversity are, for example. But I would like to start off this morning with good news for you. There's a new study that shows that tropical forests capture more CO2 than we thought. So these are results from the end of August. Although tropical forests only cover 10% of global land surface, they capture 40 to 50% of carbon stored by land vegetation. So this shows how important these forests are. So this is good news. However, there are also bad news, as we all know. Every year we lose approximately 10 million of hectares of forests. So this means almost every 4 seconds. French researchers have also discovered that the Amazon region, one of the green lungs of our planet, that it already emits more CO2 than it captures. So we might see here a huge tipping point, a historic tipping point, and we hope this could be reversed. I would like to start off with these research results, because we need to know about these hard facts in order to translate them into actions. So this is why we also have a strong research focus this morning in order to allow for policy to become better. Stopping the loss of forests means that we need a new deal, a fair deal, as we would say, between tropical forest countries and the rest of the international community. The riparian countries should not have to bear the responsibility all by themselves, because 80% of deforestation in the tropics is due to agriculture for example, the cultivation of soybeans, palm oil, cattle breeding for the export. So it is the responsibility of each and every one of us to find a solution to this problem. And therefore, the goal of such a deal must be to preserve the ecosystem services of tropical forests and to support those who want to protect the forests and use them sustainably. So this is a vision that we would like to bring to life today, together with governments, the EU, international organizations, partner organization, nature conservation experts, civil society, private business. Everyone is present today. So we want to send out a clear signal on our path towards the Climate and Biodiversity COP. This means we are taking a step forward, and the Minister Müller will talk to us later about how Germany is going to get more active in the future. More commitment also means that we have to join forces collectively and do more. The basic idea of the fair deal is that deforestation must not constitute a competitive advantage, and that protection must be more rewarding than the destruction of forests. We want to create the framework for that. Results-based payments are important here, and for us as BMZ, it is really important to involve the local communities and indigenous groups, for example, by building schools, for example, or markets. This would mean that we can link the protection of forests with the fighting of poverty. Yesterday we had the Congo Basin Forest Day, and we had countries presenting their fair deal. And this is a commitment that we should support as international community, because this is really great work that has been done. The Congo Basin forest is the only tropical forest that is a net carbon sink. I mentioned a study in the beginning, and this study shows that African forests in particular absorb more CO2 than other countries, and this is something that we need to secure. These forests are particularly important. So what do we need to do? First of all, we need to strengthen ownership and individual responsibility in the tropical forest countries themselves, and better governance. We need to secure the basis of life and livelihoods for the people on the ground. Second, we need better regulation in the consumer countries. Protecting forests also requires action here on our part, here in Europe, for example. This is about deforestation-free supply chains, for example, in global trade. And there's a regulation in the European context, for example. We need to reduce subsidies that are harming forests. This is a focus that we have to focus on here in Europe and also in other countries. And then the next point, tropical forests need appropriate and reliable finance. Only 3% of global climate funds go into tropical forest protection. This is something that we need to change, where we have to do more. I think this is a strong signal that we wish to send today. The protection of tropical forests eventually also benefits our all health. Approximately 700,000 viruses have the potential to be transmitted from wild animals to humans. This is why we need a One Health approach that takes into account the health of humans, animals, and nature, and also of forests. We have currently launched the Alliance Against Health Risks and Wild Animal Trade at the IUCN World Congress, and it is important that everybody joins forces and participates. To conclude, we often hear at global conferences that we have to save our planet. Well, I don't think that we really have to save our planet, because over millions of years, the Earth has shown that it can well take care of itself. Our goals could maybe be more individual and smaller. What it's all about is that we eventually only have to save humankind, and therefore we need to save forests. So let us use this conference to start this process. Thank you. Thank you, Michael Krake of the BMZ. Dear guests, if you would like to listen to a simultaneous translation, we have German, English, and French. Channel 1 for German, 2 for English, and 3 for French. When you're seated, you can also take off your mask, whatever is best for you. You can also leave your mask on. This is, of course, also possible. So let us continue. We have here with us today a remote scientist focusing on the mapping of large-scale land coverage and land use changes. He also focuses on developing improved algorithms and data and on mapping land coverage changes and make them visible. Natural resources can thereby be better demonstrated and monitored. And this includes also the monitoring of deforestation. He is more than just a data scientist, he is a remote sensing scientist, and he works on the development of improved algorithms. Mr. Hansen, may I welcome you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Vielen Dank, dass Sie heute mit dabei sind. Und Sie haben uns, you brought a lot of images.
Some.
Some. The stage is all yours.
Thank
you so much for joining
Katie.
us. Danke, dass Sie da sind.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation. Our work with satellite data, we're taking advantage of a technology that takes pictures of the planet in a consistent fashion. And in this way, we can track land cover, land use dynamics that make for comparisons possible between countries and regions. And my task here today is just to lay out some of the findings we have with the current trends and status of tropical forest extent and loss. In the globe, we have forest in every biome. I'm going to run an animation here that is a cumulative disturbance over the satellite record from Landsat. It's a NASA and USGS operated sensor. And you can see dynamics the world over. We have fires in the boreal, we have forestry in Sweden and Finland, forestry in the southeast US. Climate feedbacks are exacerbating fire regimes. We are having disease outbreaks in Germany, I think has been in the last couple of years, major loss of forest due to tree mortality. But if you look at this map, at the low latitudes in the Amazon basin, the Congo basin, we have vast extensive forests that are absent of change. And it just so happens these forests, as the preambles have mentioned, serve great functions for us, great carbon storage, sequestration, climate regulation, and the like. And that is largely because of the biome within which they exist. And this will be the subject of my talk. We are interested most primarily in terms of climate policy in the forests of the humid tropics. And I'll highlight that area here. It's a focus of a lot of our research because of the special qualities of these forests, which have been outlined in the previous introductory statements in terms of regulating climates and harboring biodiversity. The news on climate change feedbacks is daily, and the economic costs are mounting. And these humid tropical forests are a considerable portion of the anthropogenic forcing when we clear them for land use. And then the land uses themselves can become a forcing through emissions such as nitrous oxides from agriculture, methane from cattle ranching. And as has been mentioned, they're home to millions of indigenous peoples. So the justification for monitoring this forest is very clear. The threat is that they are where we can most easily expand our economic footprint in terms of land use for agriculture and the like. And we are introducing a lot of commodity land uses into these forests. In addition to conversion, we have logging, fire, and fragmentation. Fire dynamics in the rainforest are increasing over time. Possible climate feedback outlined there. And we talked about the tipping point of the Amazon was mentioned. The dry tropics are also a major part of this dynamic, but I will not elaborate so much on the dry tropics. This is the key take-home message from our data. We map the primary forests of the humid tropical biome and have quantified their disturbance over time. And we've gone from about 2.5 million hectares per year to over around 4 million in the last 20 years. And the point of this is that primary forests are a finite resource. We do not create new area of primary forest. We can only lose it. And while we're losing it, the rate is increasing. of loss. So this is devastating news. It really makes us, suspect in terms of the last 20 years we've been fighting this fight, and we've clearly been losing it. So this is, I think, the key take-home message. I will zoom in now to the three main tropical forest regions, and we'll follow this animation again. And here the loss is within the rainforest. It's not forestry. It's not shifting cultivation. These are clearings of high conservation value, high biomass, high biodiversity forest. And when we look at this from a perspective of national rates, we get high variance between countries. And this is just a means of kind of outlining the different dynamics that are occurring. And I'll get to the drivers after I outline the rates. So we can talk about what is the asset in each country. In Brazil, having around 30% of the remaining rainforest. The Pan-Amazon countries together accounting for over 50%, including Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. We can look at a first-order class of countries who exhibit high absolute loss of rainforest. So we have the top 10 countries here, 5 of them being in the Amazon basin. A second category of country we call high percentage loss. And so these are kind of like low forest, high forest loss countries. And this would be Paraguay and Central America. So there's two kinds of landscapes. You have the landscapes that are the core Amazon basin, the core Congo basin, that have large extents of unbroken forest. And then you have these regions such as Central America where forests have been fragmented to a point where the pressures are increasingly greater and greater on the fragments that are left, and you end up having high percent loss rates in certain countries. And this is where restoration is a priority. So you can look at those kind of countries and think, we need to hold the line on those forests and restore them. And finally, the last group of countries you can think of is, and this is not a formal naming convention, but just from our data, that fit the high forest, low deforestation category. And the Guyanas, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Costa Rica have substantial areas of rainforest with very low disturbance. In terms of South America, what are the drivers? We know that cattle is the number one driver. Commodity crops such as sugarcane and soybean in particular are also part of the global commodity chain for improving our diets globally, increasing meat in our diets. And then lesser but very important environmental impacts from artisanal mining and other smaller scale disturbances. I would just like to stress that the land use dynamics from pasture and commodity crops and the chain in which they pass is complicated. It's very hard to look at drivers if you're just looking at one commodity. So for example, we estimate in South America that natural land cover disturbed without having an identifiable land use totals 55 million hectares. So there's a lot of land tenure issues, land banking, and then eventually maybe you might see a pasture built out. And then soybean, maybe 10 years later, will replace it. So out of all of the forest loss we see in South America, 5% of it can be attributed to soybean directly as the land use that replaces the forest disturbance. Soybean is usually a very long lagging land use that replaces pasture. So this is a study that we did that reflects that point. Soybean doubles in area, but it displaces pasture into the frontier of the rainforest. And there's a strong linkage, but it's very tricky to pin everything on soybean. And in this graphic, we can see fires that are not co-located with soybean. When Macron threatened boycotting soybean, the soybean farmers were like, what are you talking about? We hate fire. Fire is used to open up the forest and for the establishment of pasture land. So I just want to make the point that the chain of land use and increasing intensification over time is an important aspect of tracking drivers and what are the causes of deforestation. When we go to Central Africa generally, we have a different story. You can see DRC jump out of the map. You can almost draw the boundaries of it on this figure. West Africa, very fragmented, small patches of forest left. The three big countries that are analogous to the Amazon basin in terms of forest extent are DRC, Gabon, Republic of Congo, and not far off is Cameroon as well. In terms of overall loss, we have DRC and Madagascar as being big gross loss leaders. Madagascar fits the category of high percentage loss countries like Paraguay. Côte d'Ivoire in particular is a sad story in terms of loss of primary forest, particularly in protected areas at a high percentage. And then Republic of Congo and Gabon being the high forest, low deforestation countries that fit with the Guyanas and other countries in South America. In terms of the drivers and the land uses, we know that the big commodities such as palm and cacao are present in Africa. Logging is not a deforestation dynamic, but still a disturbance dynamic, and smallholder agriculture, in particular DRC. We've done studies in Central Africa attributing drivers to forest disturbance, how much of the forest loss was within the old growth, primary, high conservation value forest, and what the land use outcomes of that were. And we get over 90% of, for example, DRC is smallholder agriculture inside primary forest. So this is a challenge because you're talking around 100 million people, going to grow to 300-some million people by 2100. And in DRC, it's basically people feeding themselves. So that's a sustainable livelihood issue that is very different from the kind of dynamics we have in Brazil and needs to be addressed. Shifting to Southeast Asia, similar stories, but much more intensive trends in terms of the evolution of forest loss. We have Indonesia and Papua New Guinea being the big forest countries, the last remnants of big blocks of forest. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Cambodia are high global forest loss countries and also high percentage loss countries. And some of these countries have slowing deforestation rates, and I would argue that a place like Sumatra in Indonesia, the slowing of deforestation is occurring because they've run out of forests. So you don't want to credit slower deforestation rates because they just they lost their resource. And in terms of high forest, low deforestation countries, it's Bhutan and Thailand, so a very limited set. So the much more advanced stage of the forest land use transition, we could say, in Asia. Drivers there, and this will echo a little bit the story of Brazil, it's tricky to follow what the first drivers are, but for example, palm oil, 50% of palm oil goes in directly after forest loss, 50% of it is delayed. And I'll get to that in a bit. The delay leads to idle land. We estimate in 2019 6 million hectares of cleared forest in Indonesia that has no land use, so land banking and that sort of thing. A third of palm oil has an average establishment rate after clearing of 8 years. And you could argue that the palm oil is green because it's going on degraded lands. So this kind of, again, these transitions between establishment of tenure, clearing of the forest, establishment of land use, intensification of land use, I think it's all part of the story that we need to address in terms of working with industries and communities to kind of interdict the whole dynamic. And of course, fire. Fire is across all of the tropics, but the history of fire in Indonesia is, in terms of peatlands and emissions, making it number 3 in the world in CO2 emissions because of fires and peatlands and the health consequences, it's worth mentioning for Indonesia. The last thing I want to mention is fragmentation. We've talked about a lot of areas, and these area trends are from satellites that are a particular scale. We can get different area estimates from different methods, but these trends we believe are accurate. The second part of from our spatial analysis is fragmentation, and I mentioned this regions like Central America, West Africa, mainland Southeast Asia. The forests are just small patches that are left over. A lot of protected areas are isolated patches. And we've shown in our data that the smaller the fragment, the more likely it is to be cleared. And that includes protected areas. So we lose protected areas in Central America, West Africa, and Southeast Asia at a higher rate than we do in the bigger countries with the bigger blocks of forest. So finally, I'd just like to highlight again that despite our best efforts, maybe not our best efforts, but despite the efforts of the global community, primary forests of the human tropics are increasing in terms of their loss and conversion. And this is it's alarming because it is a finite resource. So we can assume that our policies need to improve and that the land use dynamics need to be better parameterized from a holistic sense. I really don't think it's focusing on one particular commodity in the absence of all the other mitigating factors. And that I grew up in Indiana in the United States, and I'm from a deforested landscape. My state was 90% hardwood forest when the settlers came, and I live in the middle. I grew up in a bunch of middle of soybean and corn, like Mato Grosso is now. And the idea that we use that pathway to develop our countries, we need to be cognizant of that and offer a fair deal for developing countries that are being asked to forfeit that capability, that opportunity. But I love this idea of a fair deal to fully compensate countries for reducing or ending deforestation so that the ecosystem services that we all need can be sustained. Thank you.
Joining us, Matthew Hansen. Ja, liebe
Well, ladies and gentlemen, those were some insights from the scientific community, but now we'd like to have a practical discussion. And of course, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the ministers present from the African countries and also guests from the German Parliament. We have some guests from the German Parliament attending our Tropical Forest Symposium today. Because when we talk about forests, we are, of course, talking about the German government and joint efforts by the German government in the tropical forests. At almost 44 million hectares per year, Germany accounts for a large share of forest loss. That's figures from the WWF study. And how we deal with this dramatic situation on the part of different ministries, well, we'll discuss that now. We have Dr. Eva Müller with us, the Director General for Forest, Sustainability and Renewable Resources from the Federal Ministry of Agriculture. And then we have Dr. Josef Tumbrink with us. He's head of the Directorate for Biodiversity. He joins us from the Federal Ministry of the Environment. Good morning. And once again on our stage, the Director General from the BMZ, Michael Krake. And give him a hand. Yes, why not? Another applause for him. Well, this will be an exciting discussion, and we're talking about forests. We also talk about the coordination between different ministries, and when we look back on yesterday, well, today we're talking about international forests, but of course German forests are important too. And of course the Forest Strategy 2050 has made the headlines, and there were some problems, of course, or there was some controversial media coverage. So what can we do, and what is the approach you're taking? Well, what is good cooperation all about? How can we do to work together effectively? There are 3 ministries that deal with forests within the German government, but we have different roles. So we complement each other's work. Our roles are complementary. I don't want to talk on behalf of the other ministries, because you can say for yourselves what your role is, but I'm a representative of the Agricultural Ministry, and obviously, agriculture and food is our business, but of course, forest policy as well, at the national level, at the international level. And this is where we make our contributions. We don't try and do the same work that the BMZ is doing, and we don't have the funds and the instruments that the BMZ has, but we're also playing our part, especially by providing support to forest policy at the international level. And we'll talk about priorities later. Thank you. And I'd like to hand on this question to Mr. Tumbrink. We saw so many red dots highlighting forest loss internationally, but also in Germany. So it's obvious that we need to do something to protect our forests. What is good cooperation all about? Well, good and effective cooperation means that the working levels, the people at the working level have to collaborate effectively. And it's not a secret, we're ahead of the parliamentary elections. We haven't been able to complete all the work in the current electoral term. And yesterday, the Agricultural Ministry presented its strategy, but we have different tasks in the Federal Ministry of Environment. We look at nature conservation, species protection, and we also look at forests and know that they need to be used sustainably. We need to find a good balance. And in a country like Germany, it's always a way of finding compromises. But at the working level, I know that there's a very close cooperation between the ministries, and when there's some issues, these will be resolved, I'm sure. Mr. Krake, we saw that there were some controversial issues as well between the ministries, but, well, where do you see the priorities in your cooperation so that we all work together, that we join forces in the German government? Well, every policy area, of course, takes a different approach when dealing with different global issues. It's important that we organize ourselves well, that we exchange experiences, that we coordinate our activities. We, of course, introduce developing countries to the debate, because when we look at international forest policy, we need to look at concrete projects and the things that will work. And maybe we also have some lessons learned of things that can't work. So we bring in our experience from the cooperation with our partners, and that's what we bring into the debate, that's what we add to the debate, and then we have a good conversation about that. And it's fine if some individual policy areas or political departments say that they want to move ahead and present a strategy, and when it leads to competition for the best ideas, that's fine. Ms. Müller, when we look at the Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture, we had the Forest Summit in the middle of the year, and some issues were raised that also play an international role, or will play an international role, because you have to adopt a holistic global perspective when it comes to forest protection. Well, I think the big problem that all of us have, that we're all facing, well, Germany and worldwide, is climate change, of course. And forests play a major role in that. We heard that forest fires are on the rise, and we also have forest degradation in Germany on a massive scale caused by climate change. And we in Germany reacted quite quickly because we are aware, we know that we need our forests. If we want to protect the climate, we need forests, not just in Germany, but worldwide. And as I said before, we're working at the level of forest policy internationally, and for us this means that one of our priorities is to support the Forum of the United Nations, because we believe that there are many promising initiatives out there that we should pool more effectively, that we should combine to make them more effective. Let's give you an example. As part of the Global Forest Forum of the United Nations, there's an international collaborative forest partnership consisting of 15 international organizations led by the FAO, and we're supporting joint projects implemented by this initiative. So it's joint projects implemented by 15 organizations that are active in the field of forest protection and forest management. Just as an example. A second important point, we are the Ministry for Agriculture, which means that supply chains are a very important issue for us. And deforestation-free supply chains are of pivotal importance at the global level. That's what we believe. And obviously, via the Amsterdam Partnership and at the EU level, we're supporting that. And then illegal logging is another important issue. It plays a major role in degradation of forests, which is why we're working closely with the European Union and also with the Amsterdam Partnership. And a last issue I'd like to raise, well, the transfer of know-how, of expertise, knowledge about sustainable forest management. That's crucial. And the BMZ, the Development Ministry, is obviously very much involved, very active in this field. I think we complement each other's work quite effectively by supporting various programs. We have the Forest Expert Program, so German experts, upon the country's request, go to these countries and share knowledge. And together with the FAO and other partners, we started a forest education initiative because we believe that we don't just need to strengthen professionalism in this field, we also have to spread knowledge about forests. And we have to start at an early age. We need to share this knowledge with young people. Many young people growing up in the cities don't know about forests and why they're important. Deforestation-free supply chains, and I'd like to take up this term, and it's of course an important topic for the BMZ, and capacity building on the ground. What do you think your role is? You can assume actually many smallholders depend on the forest. They live on the forest or from the forest. They grew up in the forest. So, I mean, don't we have to find the right balance to provide the right kind of support? I don't really want to use the word help or aid. I want to use the word support. And what about capacity building on the ground? Well, people living from the forest, in the forest, need development prospects, opportunities for development, and we have to combine forest conservation with development programs. And the prices need to be clear. What does it cost to protect the forest, and what costs will arise, will be caused when I start cutting trees? And I'd like to come back to what Ms. Müller said. We really draw huge benefits from your work in the field of forestry, in your ministry, because things that work in Germany and that work in the European Union might also work in other countries, and we really build on the know-how, on the expertise of other policy fields in Germany. And deforestation, free supply chains affects the issue of economic policy, trade policy. So we have to win allies in these policy fields, and it will be an exciting debate because the EU Commission will present its proposal for deforestation-free supply chains, and our French partners will take over the European Council presidency, and it will be very interesting to see what will happen. I think what we've learned at the BMZ is that development policy does not happen in distant places in other countries. It also happens here in Europe and in Germany. Mr. Thunbrink, anything that we forgot to mention in this round of discussion? Anything that you'd like to add?
Well, we would like to add the following. We at the Environment Ministry, of course, responsible for the CBD, together with the colleagues of other ministries. And yes, okay, we had to split up the conference. Part of it would take place in October and then the other half next year. But for us in Germany, it's of course a very important conference because it is going to determine what's going to happen in the next decade. Whatever we decide there in Germany advocates an ambitious framework and also finance. Whatever we decide there will determine our future, because the next decade is the decisive decade both for climate action and for the protection of biodiversity. We have the climate COP taking place in Glasgow, and I think the challenge for the federal government is now to act on both issues and to balance both issues. Nature-based solutions, for example, is one option here. How you can spend $1 in order to achieve the best effect. With a view to the Paris Agreement, Germany has fulfilled its pledges. In 2015, we wanted to provide $50 million for the protection of tropical forests, and we, as the ministries, we were able to do so. However, these are not enough funds, and the next government we'll have to look at the issue of how we can further strengthen our commitment, how we can support the United Kingdom in order to provide and increase the financial framework. So this is a very big challenge we are facing. And this is really the decisive turning point. The next decade is what we have to focus on. And Germany, I think, has an important role here to play when it comes to the global level. And we just talked about what we here in Germany are doing with our 25% of forest area. Well, we do have some conflicts here in our own country, but I think on the international level, we are very well aware of our responsibility. And during our EU Council presidency, we had very ambitious biodiversity goals that we set. And then we will be holding the G7 presidency next year, and I hope that taking over the role from the United Kingdom, who have really done a great job, that we will be able to continue the wonderful work that has been done in order to hold the loss of biodiversity. And as you've mentioned in the beginning, the endangered species is actually mankind, although we are currently also threatening other species. Ms. Miller, can I talk to you again about the fair deal? Because what do you think about the fair deal? I think it is the right way. You already mentioned we are eventually all in one and the same boat, and this holds true with regard to climate change, but also with regard to the conservation of our forests around the globe. And this is why we as international community need to cooperate. And this means that if tropical forests need to be protected, then we also have to do our part in order to make sure that we actually work for conservation. And we cannot leave the riparian states all alone. So you're supporting this also with a view to the COP26 taking place in Glasgow. What can you do in order to bring the fair deal forward, to let deeds follow up on words? What are your priorities? Well, I think the symposium that we have here today can send out a very strong signal, and this is what we intended to do with this conference. We want to demonstrate that we are taking action together. And yesterday, we had the declaration of the Congo Basin Forest Partnership, which I believe is a very strong signal telling the world that we want to join forces all together, that we want to save the climate and that we want to protect our forests. Mr. Krake, you already said a couple of points with regard to this aspect. Let me ask you, what is the current attitude at the Federal Environment Ministry? Well, yes, we need to do more in this respect, and of course, we are the countries that these products are being exported to. We already talked about supply chains. This is a difficult topic, not only on the part of the government, but also on the part of the companies present in the supply chain. We really need to look at the issue that here in Germany we need fair prices, and that we have to make sure that we understand that what we do here can affect or is affecting what is happening elsewhere. This is also important with regard to climate change. Then there's also the restoration decade going on. And this is just the right moment for this topic. Also, when we speak about fragmentation and tropical forests, how can we reduce these trends? And this decade is an opportunity for us to do something about this. I think all of these things are interconnected. And I cannot really imagine that if the consumers here in Germany really knew what they are buying. This is, of course, another question we are discussing a lot here in Germany. What about transparency? Do we know what we buy? Well, I think that consumers here in Germany wouldn't feel comfortable with buying products that are not traded in a fair way. They want fair products. They want deforestation-free products. Let me ask the representative of the Agriculture Ministry, is there a demand? Do consumers want to know where their products that they buy come from, if they are sustainable? Well, I don't think that this trend is currently visible enough, but I think this is something that we see more and more, and I think the pandemic contributed to this and contributed to the people here in Germany wanting to consume and eat more sustainable products. And they are starting to ask more questions about whether or not these products are sustainable, or whether they are healthy, etc. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic really improved the situation. But it could, of course, be much better. So I have to keep an eye on the clock. Thank you so much to all of you who were present here. Thank you for this conversation. And it was interesting to see how all of you want to join forces. I would like to thank Dr. Müller from the Agriculture Ministry. I would like to thank Dr. Tumbrink from the Federal Environment Ministry and Mr. Krake of the BMZ. Thank you very much. Dear guests, so they are going to reorganize the stage for our next panel discussion. And I would like to use the time to ask you what you think, because, you know, this isn't a new normal that we have these hybrid events. And it's of course wonderful to see so many of you live here, but we also have a huge audience joining us online, and we would like to hear from you, from where in the world you are joining us. Please just let us know with one word from which city you are joining us. We would really like to know that, because we want to learn more about you, where exactly you are from and from where you are watching, so that we have the opportunity to continue discussing with you later on. And you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So I can see the word cloud here. Thank you so much for your responses, dear audience. It is always exciting to see how many of you are present. We have guests from the IUCN Congress, guests joining us from Berlin, Brussels, then from the city of Bonn. Greetings to the Rhineland here in Germany. Welcome to our guests in Cameroon. Merci bien, bienvenue. We have guests joining us from Washington. A warm welcome over the big pond. Thank you for joining us. Freiburg, Marburg, Kampala. So warm regards to Uganda. It's very international. London, Marseille, Edinburgh. And from Madagascar. Merci, thank you for being with us. Barcelona, Europe, France, of course, many people joining us from the IUCN. I'm delighted to have you in our audience. I know you were very busy. We are taking on the baton here from Marseille and continuing the process here in Berlin, and then we will all go to Glasgow, so we are following one path together. Then from Australia, somebody's joining us from Australia, so this is already quite late over there. You're probably having your afternoon cocktail over there. So hello to Melbourne, San Francisco, very early in the morning. So thank you for joining us at 1 a.m. Equatorial Guinea, Rwanda. Merci beaucoup. Thank you for joining us. Nepal. So as you can see, there are so many people joining us from all over the world. And in these times of the pandemic, we often have so many video conferences, and this shows us again that we are one world and that together we are working on so many important issues. So thank you for joining us. Oxford, Jakarta, Indonesia. Thank you for being with us. Many greetings to Indonesia, a country with many forests. So I think I've mentioned everyone who is present. Marseille, so warm regards to Marseille. I'm delighted to have you on board today. And best of wishes to Jakarta as well. So thank you for being here with us today. We've already mentioned a couple of topics, and now of course we would like to talk about even more questions. And we also said that we wanted to discuss with many different stakeholders about their different points of views. And we want to show together that we do not only talk about each other, but also with each other, of course. And I would like to ask to the stage our guests who are joining us live here in the audience, but also those who are joining us virtually. And I would like to start with the Minister for Forestry, Oceans and other things from Gabon. Before he became a minister, he was a member of the Gabonese National Park Authority, and before that he worked for the Wildlife Conservation Society. Under his leadership, ladies and gentlemen, he was combating illegal wildlife trade. I would like to welcome to the stage Professor Lee White. Thank you for being here. Merci. I would also like to welcome the Vice Minister for Environment of Ecuador. Since 2021, she is the new Vice Minister. Before that, she worked for the city of Guayaquil, which is this city in Ecuador, which is deemed the gate to the Pacific and which is often the start for expeditions to the Galapagos Islands. So you know more or less where she's from. She's agricultural engineer and a specialist for ecological economy. So especially the point where we have to look at viability of combining economics and natural and conservation of nature. So welcome, Ms. Dager. So if you could join me here on my left-hand side. Thank you. Merci. Thank you for being here. Ms. Janet Rogan. Since this year, she's the regional ambassador of the COP26 for the Middle East and Africa and special ambassador. For 30 years now, she has been working for the Federal Foreign Office of the United Kingdom. And of course, she was abroad quite a lot in the Far East, Middle East, on the Balkans, Africa. What does the Agenda 2030 mean for her? Of course, that's a question we're going to that she deals with. Welcome. So I think you can take place just over there, or take a seat. Sorry, take a seat. Also with us, Shamsat Kuru. She is the Deputy Director of the International Tropical Timber Organization. Thank you so much for joining us. She's responsible for forestry, international negotiations. This is her day-to-day job. You've been working in this area for more than 2 decades. And of course, together with you, we would like to discuss the topic of how the international trade with tropical timber can be made sustainable. Shamsat Kuru, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Also with us today, joining us online, present here with us from the European Commission, Hugo Maria Chali. He is Director General of the Unit Multilateral Environmental Cooperation in the Director General Environment. He coordinates and develops the cooperation of the European Commission with international environmental organizations, and in the context of the multilateral environmental agreements, he is busy, so welcome for being here. And please join us on this. Yeah, please join us. Mr. Shali, I hope you can hear and see us. This is also, of course, a small sound check that we try to do. Can you just say hello and show me whether you can hear me? Mr. Shali, can you hear me okay? Yes, welcome. Good morning from Brussels. Okay, wonderful. I can hear you okay as well. Thank you for being with us. I would also like to welcome a guest from China of the National Forestry Administration who joins us online, Dr. Xing Yong. He is Associate Professor at the Forest Policy and Information Research Institute of the Chinese Academy of Forestry, and he's also the coordinator of the bilateral coordination mechanism between China and the European Union. Good evening to you in China, Dr. Xing Yong. So I hope you can hear me. Okay. Can you hear us?
Genau, da ist der Hinweis.
Wonderful. Okay, so we just heard that he can hear us okay. So there will be consecutive interpreting. We are delighted to have you here. Last but not least, our last two guests, the campaign coordinator for the NGO active in Brussels, Fern. The goal is to focus on social and ecological justice with the focus on people living in the forests, and in order to advocate for these people in the European Union. She works on the topics of energy and forest policy. And for this NGO that I just mentioned, Hanna Mowat, welcome. Thank you for being here. And last but not least, the director of the Zoological Society of Frankfurt, and who also works for the society Hilfe für die bedrohte Tierwelt, Help for the Endangered Species. Mr. Schenk, welcome on the stage. Thank you. So we've already talked a lot about forests. Now I would like to start off by talking about the green lungs of our Earth. And I would now like to ask the representatives of the countries of Gabon and Ecuador to tell us what you believe is possible. We talk a lot about destruction and damage to forests and all the risks and threats, but we also need to talk about opportunities. And then we need to learn about what you are doing and your best practices, because I know that Ecuador is often called a champion. Can you tell those present here what works well in your country in order to protect forests?
Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to be here to talk about what the challenges, but also the opportunities and what my country has been doing. First of all, let me have a quick introduction of Ecuador. Ecuador is one of the 10 more mega biodiverse countries in the world. We have 91 ecosystems with unique flora and fauna. Out of those 91 ecosystems, 65 are tropical ecosystems. We have 12.5 million hectares of native forests. 60% is in our land territory. 74% of those 12.5 hectares are in the Amazon rainforest. 51% of our national forest and the rainforest are under some sort of conservation. We have 4 very challenging programs, but I would like to talk about Sociobosque, which is a program in English I might translate as the Forest Partner, which is a huge program that basically pays by results. We pay communities, we pay small forest owners in order to conservate in a 20-year MOU. So it's a very long-term commitment in order to preserve our tropical forests. There is 1.6 million hectares under this kind of conservation. Around 200,000 people, especially in indigenous communities and native communities under this commitment. 84% of those are in the tropical forests. Ecuador has been a pioneer in REDD+, which is a mechanism to mitigate climate change. We are one of the first countries working in REM, which is Red Early Movers, which is actually a project funded by the German and the Norway governments. And also we work with the GCF and the GEF with Pro Amazonia, which is an amazing program that it's also helping small communities and within the Amazon to protect our forests and also to reinforce our supply chain in agriculture, especially in palm oil, cattle, cocoa, and coffee. We have a national reforestation program. Our goal is to be able to restore 30,000 hectares by 2025. But I would also like to talk about the alternatives, because 95% of our land loss has to do with agriculture challenges and urban growth, 5%. We definitely need to work with integrated fire management. This year we have had an enormous win, because we have decreased the amount being in the dry season. We have decreased the fire alarms, and also bioeconomy. We need to have a supply chain approach. Since we are still an oil-based economy, this new government has put into our scene the transition, the ecological transition. Our ministry changed our name from being just environment and water, but environment, water, and ecological transition, which means that we are committed to a low-emission, climate resilient, and especially the coexistence between biodiversity with social development. And this is a huge challenge, a long-term vision and a long-term approach, and definitely being here and being with, the international arena and cooperation is something that needs to be strengthened.
Vielen Dank, Frau Dager. Thank you so much. Gracias.
Thank you very much. Minister, so after you've heard what was just mentioned, did you take any notes that could also be applied to Gabon? What would you say are the developments that you have witnessed in Gabon, which you would see as a challenge or as positive when we talk about sustainable forestry and also the protection of tropical forests? Thank you. Gabon is part of the Congo Basin and the Congo Basin forest. It is one of the black countries that we've just seen on the maps presented by Mr. Hansen. There was no red, no deforestation. It is a country with a lot of forest coverage. And incredible forests, where you have trees that can grow to 70 meters and more. There are trees that are 1,000 years old. You can see that in the Congo Basin, the forests are often very high. So this means that they can store and capture CO2 in the vegetation and in the soils. And the Congo Basin forests are very important for many reasons. The most important reason here is, of course, that these are forests that are very resilient with regard to climate change. We can see that these rainforests are dying around the world because of droughts, heat waves. But the rainforests in the Congo Basin are the most resilient ones, and this is why they become more and more important. Mr. Hansen has just mentioned something very interesting. He talked about a fair deal. I think that we should rather be talking about optimization. Let me just give you an example, which might be a bit upsetting. There are CO2 emissions in many sectors, such as transport, urban areas, deforestation, forest use, and the emissions amount to 35 million tons, very low emissions. However, 40 million tons of CO2 are captured every year. This means we are not just climate neutral, but we do capture more CO2 than we actually emit. So this means 15% of Germany's emissions are being offset by our country. because Germany emits quite a lot of CO2. This means we are capturing 15% of Germany's emissions. The challenge here is that we have to keep on going and keep on doing this until the year 2050. We have to remain a net carbon sink. But this means also that we have to give the forests an economic value, also in the interest of the Gabonese people. We have to create incentives in order to make sure that this carbon can continue to be captured. And we need a fair deal for countries that are acting as a carbon sink in order for us to preserve these forests and protect them. We do not necessarily believe in the pledges made by RED. For 15 years we've been talking about this and we have seen almost no results. Norway does quite a lot, is putting in a lot of effort, but we don't see this very much around the world. So we in Gabon, we have developed our own model. When we export products to Germany, France and China, for example, without processing the timber in our country, then we only keep 8% of the value in our country. This means we give 92% of its value to the countries we are exporting the timber to. And this is actually the disease that Gabon is tackling, and of course the entire continent of Africa. We have a resource, a natural resource that we produce, but then other people are making money with that. And we want to do something against this. We want to ban export. We want to create value in Gabon. We want to create jobs in Gabon with the timber that is being harvested in our country. And thereby we can make more of our woods and increase its value by the factor of 10. So this means the forests are a job creation tool in our economy in Gabon, and it is in our very own interest to protect these forests. Of course, this could maybe even become more profitable or sustainable in the future with a fair price on carbon. A fair carbon price that would recognize the ecosystem services and other services we provide with regard to biological diversity, for example, because we are responsible for the rain in the Sahel region. We are the ones who produce rain in Ethiopia. The Blue Nile depends on us, on our forests. And this is why we need a fair carbon price. Because this is much more valuable than a ton of CO2 produced in any European country in a coal-fired power plant. However, in reality, what we see is that your CO2 certificate is worth 70 euros and ours 5. So this is why we are trying to create an economic model that will protect rainforests across the world. Thank you.
Thank you. We've heard a lot of questions, a lot of responses. I'd like to go back to Mr. Schalli. Now you heard what was said. Well, would you agree to what was said? Do you think that the minister's approach would be a viable one? And then when we look at the EU, accounting for 16% of deforestation in 2017. That was the first spot. The second spot, the first spot was China, but the second spot was EU. What does it mean in terms of responsibility for the EU? And how can the European Union, as an important donor and an important consumer, act also in terms of financial support? Mr. Schalli. Well, good morning once again, and hello from Brussels. I'm very pleased to join you this morning, albeit only in a virtual format. When you look at tropical forests and their increasing threat or being threatened, and we've been doing that in the EU for a long time, so if we watch the situation, you realize that the risks have shifted from illegal timber logging to the expansion of land use. So more agricultural use of forests, that's really the shift that we see. And when you look at the numbers of recent years and what's the trend of these environmental impacts, we can also see that the European Union and its member states, through the consumption of these agricultural commodities and products containing these commodities, has played a key role and has added to forest loss, really. In the European Union, we've had programs and legislation for many years that try to counter the problem of illegal logging and the trade associated with this illegally harvested timber. And over the past 15 and 20 years, we've successfully implemented this legislation. But in recent years, we've realized that it's not enough, that more needs to be done, which is why in 2019 we presented a communication outlining a holistic concept for the European Union to tackle the problem of global deforestation and forest degradation. And we have various priorities in this communication, which complement very much or are very much in line with what the ministers said. First of all, the European Union is the final consumer market for many of these products and commodities, so we bear a special responsibility, and we must ensure that these products and these commodities are only introduced to the European market when it can be ensured that in producer countries they don't lead to deforestation, forest loss, and degradation of forests, whilst also ensuring that the consumption of products that are being produced fairly should be supported. Well, when we talk about different commodities, timber, for example, we think that there are no products that necessarily undermine the principle of sustainability. I think they can be sustainable. And in the course of this year, we want to present a proposal on how to deal with this within the European Union. Timber, for example, palm oil, cocoa, coffee. How to ensure that these commodities will only enter the European markets when they are from sustainable production. And another essential aspect is how to work with the producer countries and provide incentives for a transition towards sustainable management of agricultural production systems. And here the European Commission is working on the concept of what we call forest partnerships. So it's really an offer that we're making to producing countries. We want to present them with this offer, and if the countries are interested in working with us in terms of sustainable forest management and sustainable production systems, that's one thing. And then, of course,
So now I can hear you. Please go on.
Thank you, Katie. And if I may, I would like to start by saying thank you to Gerd Muller. I don't know if he's here, and it's not because I'm British and we have a national obsession with being polite. It's because the framing of this conference is absolutely spot on. A fair deal for forests. Fairness isn't something that you just add on. It's a fundamental underlying precondition for policies to work. I'm based in France, and we understood very, very well the importance of fairness in policies with the Gilets jaunes uprising, the Gelbwestung-Bewegung, where French citizens managed to force a U-turn on Emmanuel Macron's carbon tax. A carbon tax that was so desperately needed, but citizens didn't think it was.
Donc, excusez-nous pour les problèmes techniques. Donc, je pense que le plus grand problème dans l'architecture qui protège donc nos forêts, donc par exemple la politique européenne, je voudrais poser 3 questions. Est-ce que ce serait équitable pour les personnes, pour les communautés, car elles sont vraiment au-devant. Nous avons donc besoin que les entreprises ne doivent pas produire de manière exempte de la déforestation, mais également elles doivent protéger les communautés. Est-ce que ceci serait vraiment équitable pour pouvoir améliorer la gouvernance forestière? Donc, sinon, il n'y aura pas de coopération. Sinon, il y aurait juste un marché de niche pour créer des produits.
Thirdly, will it be fair? Will it be a fair process? Fern has been very committed and invested in the FLEGT process, partly because it gives a real space to civil society to be part of negotiating and developing policies, which also means that they are there to push governments to implement policies, because policies are only ever as strong as they are when they're actually being implemented, and civil society play a crucial role in ensuring that. So those would, I mean, there's plenty more to say, but for me, those would be the 3 things that I would say at this point.
Fragen. Und wir möchten natürlich dann jetzt auch nochmal den Ball.
Well, and now we'd like to go back to the private sector. We have James Setkour with us, Director of Operations, International Tropical Timber Organization. It's so wonderful to have you with us this morning, Ms. Sakuru. So now we've talked about forest management and about sustainable forest use and the fair deal that has just been addressed. What are the issues that need to be addressed so that everything is actually fair? How can everything be made fair and sustainable also in the private sector? And I'd also like to know what needs to happen on timber markets in the fight against illegal logging and overexploitation when too much is taken out of the forest. So what is your point of view? What are the points that you'd like to see implemented?
Thank you very much for that long list of questions, actually, Katie. And could I also begin by thanking the federal government of Germany for their willingness to have me here as a speaker on this panel, as well as to all the distinguished panelists who are sitting with me. Thank you so much. I come from the International Tropical Timber Organization. We are a 74 membership-based international organization, sub-UN, you could say, mandated under the International Tropical Timber Agreement of 2006, which is a baby from the United Nations Conference of Trade and Development. Hence, tropical forestry sits with 50% of our membership. 45% of the global forest area of 4 billion hectares is actually tropical forests. So that's just under 2 billion hectares globally. ITTO's membership covers 80% of global tropical forest areas, and they account for 90% of the international trade in tropical timber products. Now, I also wish to thank several speakers this morning who have highlighted some key factors. I couldn't agree more with the DG, Michael Gregg, when you said that more investments need to go into tropical forestry. I could not agree more. We need to work really hard to increase the investment of 3% of climate funds that goes into tropical forestry, purely because in carrying out ITTO's mandate, 50% of which is implementing sustainable forest management in the tropics, and the other 50% of our mandate is diversifying the trade in legal and sustainably produced tropical products. None of this comes free. Unfortunate, but none of it comes free. The air we breathe does not come free. Now, in discussing today's fair deal, the professor from the University of Maryland, Mr. Hansen, Professor Hansen, he mentioned that tropical countries very often have to make sacrifices, and I couldn't agree more with that either. In trying to fit in with regulations in consuming markets, it is very often producing countries that have to work at trying to implement these measures and meet these requirements. And in many countries it works and it succeeds. In many countries it doesn't, and the reason for that, the underlying cause is poverty and the lack of value that is given to forest areas, which is why agriculture becomes a more viable economic revenue to feed growing populations and to increase the income for countries. Professor Lee White just mentioned what happens in Gabon. So when we talk about a fair deal, forgive me for saying this, it's a good place to start. Fair deal is a good place to start. But for one who comes from the tropics myself, I think an equitable deal is what we need to push for. An equitable deal means all those who are involved get the equal opportunity to aim for specific objectives, whilst taking select circumstances into consideration. And could I just continue just for 2 more minutes to say that all the tropical countries that are present in this room and those who are calling in from abroad will definitely realize, and I'm sure that the German government and all our generous donor governments like the US, Japan, EU, and several others, they will all realize that the processing capacity needs help. Capacity building needs help. Sharing of technical assistance needs help. Education, as Madame Eva Müller mentioned earlier, is critical. And where ITTO is concerned, we have been involved in all the UN-based instruments. We are one of the 15 members of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests in implementing projects on the ground. ITTO has implemented over 1,200 projects in its 35-year life cycle and intends to continue doing this. But we plead for support from all our membership to keep the organization going in order to maintain and enhance our relevance. In terms of how else the German government can help, I would really again urge your active involvement in the fact dialogues in the build-up to the COP26. ITTO is part of one of the multi-stakeholder groups that is feeding into the intergovernmental processes, and I'm more than willing to share the information that we have from that, because it is key that we look forward to work beyond COP26 and beyond Kunming. Very often, when a COPS is coming up, there's a number of initiatives that are in the pipeline that get announced at the COP and then dies out like hot air, should I say. And we have to really make sure that this time that does not happen, because what everyone thinks with the risks that tropical forestry face in the future is very real. I think all the ministers who are in this room will also agree that it is very real. And it is a joint responsibility on all our parts to try and ensure the sustainability of tropical forestry and its people. Thank you, Katie, for now.
Frau Sadhguru, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sadhguru. And I'd like to talk about the environment that the private sector will need, the concrete conditions that will be required. But I'd like to come back to Ms. Rogan when you mentioned the COP26. Well, that was a clear call. Let's go beyond the COP26. Let us move forward. And the question to you, Ms. Rogan, also with regard to the responsibility that the UK has, how will the UK, as part of COP26, well, to move forests into the very core of the debate, not just at the COP, but also beyond?
Absolutely. It's come on. Katie, thank you very much. And again, likewise, let me thank the federal government for in bringing us together here today. And in fact, all of the ministers and other specialists who have joined from around the world. When we talk about a fair deal, I think we've also got to recognize what was unfair about where we've come from. And I think that's part of what we've looked at when we are designing COP26 and how we're going to put forests and nature right at the heart of this work. Because when we look at forests, for example, probably only 3%, I think we said, of global climate funding has gone into forests over the last decade. And even in that, over the three major biomes that we've talked about today, I think the Congo Basin has had probably 3 to 5 times less funding than the Amazon and Southeast Asia. So when we think about the fact that we're all driving towards net zero, and forests and deforestation have a very big impact on the question of net zero, we really need to think about how are we treating forests and land use within this broader agenda. So for that reason, when it comes to COP26, we've put forests and land use really as a high priority on the agenda. When we have the World Leaders Summit on the first 2 days of COP26, we will have a special forests and land use event where we will be encouraging heads of state, of course, to really pick up the baton for this and to endorse our vision statement for forests and land use, to really lead the way. At the same time, and we've heard a lot about it today, we're looking very much at how to break the link between commerce and illegal practices and activities that are heading towards deforestation and unsustainable land use. Now, unsustainable land use can also come through agriculture, and we've heard the pressures that drive people towards cutting down forests in order to expand the agricultural activities. So we need also to encourage the private sector farming at all levels, whether it's at the commercial scale or right down to the small scale farmers, to be able to undertake farming and agriculture activities in a sustainable manner. So again, in that we're looking for a roadmap to come out of COP26 to break the link between those sort of activities that bring about commercial activity and deforestation and unsustainable land use. That brings me just onto one point about finance. Of course, we've heard a lot about the enormous demands on finance that are out there, and this goes across the whole climate agenda. So I think we are really trying to number one, make that commitment that this famous $100 billion that the developed countries pledged in Paris to raise every year for the developing countries across the board for all parts of the agenda will definitely be achieved from coming out of COP26. And at the same time, we're looking to make access to finance easier. Because one of the problems we've seen, especially when it comes to projects and activities that have a cross-cutting impact through both mitigation and adaptation, is that it's very, very difficult to get access to the funding, even if the funding is made available. So we're trying to find, through a task force on access to finance, how we can improve accessibility of finance to those countries that need it. So when we look at the private sector and private investment, we're also looking to push private investment to ensure that they are embedding net zero in their financial products and their financial investments. And that really is important when we come to the activities we've talked about today, because forests are part of net zero. If we want to keep 1.5 alive, then we need to take into account forests in a way that we have not up to now. Forests are both an absorber of carbon, so they are by definition contributing to net zero. And if we cut them down, they have the potential to become emitters through agricultural and other products. So therefore, likewise, we are looking to make sure that our investments all go towards net zero, and that our multilateral development banks and their funding from the public sector also support that level of transformative activity when it comes to land use and forests. I think when we look at COP26, we're looking at the Paris Agenda, we're looking at mitigation, at adaptation and resilience, keeping 1.5 alive, producing equitable finance across the board, but particularly when it comes to our forests and land use, I think raising the bar when it comes to finance. And finally, collaboration to bring together our communities, to bring together the private sector, the public sector and under government leadership, and also our indigenous communities. We haven't mentioned much today about the knowledge and the importance of indigenous communities, but I think that's absolutely key when it comes to the forest agenda. Let me stop there. Thank you, Katie.
Vielen Dank, Frau Rogan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rogan. Mr. Chen-Yong, I haven't forgotten you. Mr. Schenk, I'll be addressing you in a minute, but first of all, a question to Mr. Lee White. Are you convinced? And what has been discussed now, is it convincing?
Bitte um eine relativ knackige und kurze Antwort.
Please just give us a very short response.
I think it's a start to be having discussion. C'est un bon début, mais on doit aller en profondeur.
But we need to go deeper. Okay, we can talk about net zero emissions, deforestation, and zero deforestation in the supply chains, but will Switzerland install a ban on chocolate? Well, this is the question we have to ask ourselves here. Have you really been digging very deep when you were looking for a definition of deforestation-free? Our impression is that these are only topics that are addressed to us as developing countries. Deforestation-free seems to be something that applies to developing countries, but not to Europe, for example, and its agriculture. Agriculture in Europe can do what it wants and invest in deforestation and then grow crops such as potatoes. This also counts into deforestation, but however, there's nobody following up on this. We have to really dig deep here and go into detail and find win-win solutions that are just and fair. We have come to a good start, however, there's much more we need to do. So we do really want to enter in this conversation with each other, and I would now like to give the floor to Beijing in China, Dr. Jin Yong. When we speak about deforestation, we also look, of course, to the figures in China. 24% of internationally caused deforestation was due to China. And this is also why we would like to ask the question of how China can assume its responsibility as one of the important consumer countries. And when we talk about the framework conditions, also provide for framework conditions that provide for deforestation-free supply chains and sustainable forest use. Also, when it comes to the upcoming COP and the commodity trialogue. I hope you can hear us very well. I know there's a consecutive interpretation. This is why we will wait a second for you until you finish. But maybe you could share your point of view on this. What do you believe to be the responsibility of China in this respect?
Würden Sie kurz stoppen, damit wir die Übersetzung schon mal haben, damit wir das in Stücken auf...
Could we just briefly interrupt? Could you just briefly interrupt? It would be helpful if you could just take a break and then we could translate the first sentences so that we can engage in a discussion, because it would be difficult to hear a full speech because we have to wait for translation first. So if it's okay, we'll take it in short bits. So it would be great if you could just stop now and we can translate the first sentences.
Gentlemen, good morning. As an important terrestrial ecosystem, forests plays a key role in providing products and services for human society and economic development, in combating the global climate change, and in protecting biodiversity. As the host country of CBD COP15, China will join hands with all parties to push the global biodiversity governance to a new level. The COP15 is themed by ecological civilization, building a shared future for all life on Earth. Emphasizing the ecological civilization for years, China wrote the eco-civilization into its constitution. Chinese forestry sector has taken concrete measures to boost afforestation, forest quality, natural forest conservation, forest city and national park construction, and made remarkable achievements in the past years.
同时，作为全球主要的林产品加工和贸易国家，中国秉承互利共赢、可持续发展的原则，推进全球森林资源合作，坚决反对不财富的采伐及不公平交易行为，采取了有力的措施。第一，修订森林法，加强森林执法与监督；第二，积极探索适应动物国情与国际接轨的木材管理和机制。
Meanwhile, China has been striving to fulfill the international responsibilities as one of the major forest product processors and traders in the world. China has been advancing global cooperation in forest resources and fighting against illegal logging and unfair trade. In the principles of mutual benefit, win-win result, and sustainable development, China has taken a series of effective measures. First, China revised the forest law to strengthen the law enforcement and monitoring. Secondly, China has been exploring the timber management and transaction system, which also considers the Chinese situation.
第三，加强引导与服务，提高企业自律和责任意识，推动公平贸易，提倡绿色采购。第四，倡导形成政府鼓励、规划引导、金融机构支持、合同企业为主体、加工园区为载体、市场化运作六位一体的合作共赢模式。第五，积极参与和推进热带森林保护和持续国际进程。中国是国际热带木材组织成员国，与包括加盟在内的13个热带森林国家签署了林业合作协议。中国与德国、欧盟、美国、澳大利亚、日本等建立了对话机制，并开展再采伐相关合作，为促进热带森林保护、可持续管理和合法生产贸易做出了积极贡献。
Thirdly, China improved its guidance and services, increased the enterprises' awareness of self-discipline and responsibilities, boosted fair trade, and advocated green procurement. Fourthly, China developed a 6-in-1 cooperation model to realize the win-win situation by government encouragement, plan-based development, financial institution support, leading companies leadership, processing park carrier, and market-based operation. Fifthly, China actively joined and promoted the international processes in tropical
Vielen
forest
Dank, Mr. Young.
conservation.
Vielen Dank aus Berlin nach.
Well, thank you very much from Berlin to Peking. We need to continue our discussion here on the panel, and we also want to hear your questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please write them directly into the Slido chat, and I can see these questions directly on my screen, and I can pass on the question to the panelists. I have a question to Mr. Schenk. We haven't really talked a lot about the local and indigenous communities, and it would also be interesting to hear your point of view with regard to forest protection, forest conservation management. You just came back from Marseille. You're also supporting the Legacy Landscape Fund. What are the priorities? What are the issues that are most important to you? What would you like to highlight and emphasize at this point? Well, I think the microphone is not working right now. It's been switched off. So what are your priorities? I think it's hugely important that we become aware of the dramatic situation that we're facing. We talked, or the US President talked about an alert situation that we have. It's really an emergency situation. Now, we talked with the Brazilian activists and scientists yesterday that talked about thousands of fires in the forest. We're really nearing the tipping point that was mentioned before, which means that we will see forests depleting themselves, deforesting themselves. It's a cruel scenario. You don't need an axe, you don't need to cut trees, because otherwise, if we reach the tipping point, the forest will die and will emit large amounts of forests. And an important researcher said yesterday, it's the end of the world as we know it. And we know from computing models, we talk of a rate of 20 to 25% of deforestation. We're currently at 17%. I don't know why the international community doesn't call on the UN Security Council and tell them, well, we cannot go on like this. Well, if we meet again here in 3 years' time and Mr. Rook succeeds in finding a minister who can organize such an important symposium, and if in 3 years' time we haven't been able to halt this development, we've sort of dug our own grave. That will be the situation in 3 years' time. We're really facing a dramatic situation. And as I said, the scenario is hugely threatening, so we have to find solutions. There are good approaches out there. What we need is an expansion of nature reserves, of protected areas. And it's obvious, it's been proven that species are protected much more effectively. There's much more biodiversity in these areas. We need an increase of 30% in terms of nature reserves, in terms of protected areas, both with regard to land and the seas. So otherwise we won't be able to stabilize the situation, as Mr. Krake rightly said. So where should these areas be? Climate change, biodiversity loss, and pandemics, those are the three challenges. And in Africa, water as well, water reservoirs, hydrological services. So the Palo Mountains in Ethiopia, for example, 12 million people depend on this forest. When this forest has disappeared, there'll be floods and no one will be able to live there any longer. So we need these protected areas. We need funding for these protected areas. And you mentioned the keyword, the buzzword. We need an innovative finance mechanism that was born here in Germany, but it's an international instrument, the Legacy Landscape Instrument, to provide sustainable, continued funding, permanent funding for these protected areas, because protected areas don't have any half-life. In 1872, the Yellowstone National Park was set up, and it wasn't planned to be closed again. So what we need is permanent funding, $1 million per year per protected area for eternity, really. Together with the NGOs on the ground, Conservation Society, Wildlife Conservation Society, Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund. So all these actors can implement these projects, and these approaches are so important. There are two decisive myths that we have to do away with. The first myth is that protected areas hinder development. That's something that we hear a lot from the tropical regions. Well, we've seen a development in the north and in the east of the planet, which is development that is not sustainable. But the African continent cannot go into the future if it adopts the same development model that we used to apply here. By 2050, we'll see 1 billion people more on this planet, 100 million more people in Africa. We need sustainable development, and protected areas, nature conservation are part and parcel of that, because they will make development possible. And the second myth I'd like to do away with is the protection of indigenous peoples and communities, because people keep saying that there's always a problem, there will be conflicts when you try and protect areas, then there will be conflicts with indigenous communities, but these communities, they need the forests, so they also need the protected areas, and we need strong, robust partnerships, and then we'll be able to sort of, resolve this very dramatic situation. Well, thank you very much for this first round. I know there are many people on this panel, so thank you very much for this very interesting first panel. You shared a lot of very important insights with us, important information. But I want to be fair, so I want to look at the questions from the audience, because I promised I would do that. And if there are any questions here in the room, I can see a few hands here as well. There's a microphone, and it's over there. It's in this part of the room, so you can just go there to this microphone. It's being set up here, and please go to the microphone if you have a question here from this room. And Minister Daga, the first question goes to you. Jay Kerry from the US. Jay Kerry, thank you very much for telling us your name and the country. Thank you very much for having joined us. And the question is the following. Well, Ecuador has clearly reduced deforestation or logging in your country, but the destruction of the Amazon forest goes on. So what can Ecuador do in concrete terms to protect this important ecosystem? And what kind of support do you need from the international community, Ms. Daga? And please be very specific and concise. Thank you.
Well, first, thanks so much for the question, because it's I couldn't agree more with the colleagues and panelists, of course. And this is why we decided to have an ecological transition approach, because definitely we are still an oil-based and also potential mining-based economy. So that's why we really need to have attractive options. And what I wanted to say is that we are really pushing, because we do believe that in the conservationist economy, we have a competitive advantage. We don't need to create one. We already have one. But in order to have a fair deal, we need to acknowledge that this is not only a climate change challenge, but it's also a poverty challenge. And with that in mind, we need to understand that we need to give, and referring to these specific questions, but that can translate throughout the world, we need to give attractive choices and a long-term approach to our communities, and within the Amazon, with our indigenous communities, and that means capacity building. I couldn't agree more with that. It needs to law enforcement. We need to control illegal practices. So that's major challenges. But we also need to talk about inclusion. We need to talk about equality, and we need to real support our supply chain production, and we really need to enforce the new normal and to create the real power of the market.
Vielen Dank, Frau Dager. Vielen Dank, auch dass Sie heute da sind.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I would now like to focus on the questions from our audience. So you can ask your questions. I will write them down, and then maybe we can sum up a couple of questions. So you are welcome to start, and then I will distribute the question and direct them to the responsible person. Just a very brief question.
I'm Indonesian ambassador to Germany. Indonesia is, of course, part of the VPA countries, the FLEGT countries, and I want to talk about fair and equitable. And the question will be for Ambassador Rogan, also Minister White. The trading of EU and other countries with VPA countries, the timber trading is $5.8 billion. But the timber product trading of EU and China is $9 billion. And the second biggest trading of EU of timber trade is with the US, which is $8 billion. So the number speaks for itself when we talk about fairness. Okay. The second issue is that within the Treaty of FLEGT, there is a chapter called market incentive. And the market incentive says that EU shall promote our FLEGT products in the EU procurement policies. This is legally binding. So I took my chances, I tried my luck, I write a letter to minister presidents in Germany, 16 of them, only 3 replied, 2 said, I don't know what it is. I don't know what FLEGT is. I'm not going to use FLEGT as a public policy procurement for us. So quite fair, no?
Das ist Ihre Frage?
Yeah, the third one and the last one would be the information that I received from a colleague from NGO is that European Union will end FLEGT schemes this December. This is what I heard. There has been some concerns, and the reason was I was told that negotiation on FLEGT is long, arduous, costly, so...
Gerne Ihre Frage.
Yeah, and the question is, advice, actually, I would like to seek advice. What should we do as a FLEGT countries on this issue? Should we negotiate with EU further, discuss that? Shall we take EU to European Court of Justice? And if EU end FLEGT scheme, so what are we going to do, the FLEGT countries? What are we going to do? Gabon, what will Gabon do? Will you be with us, for instance, bring this issue to WTO?
Ja.
That is the question. Advice.
Vielen Dank. Ich habe das.
Thank you very much. So these questions are addressed to Ms. Rogan and Mr. White. Maybe just another question, and then maybe we can link these 2 questions. Just one question, please. Thank you very much. I am the Environment Minister of the Republic of the Congo. First of all, I would like to congratulate the federal government on this wonderful initiative which allows us to talk about forests and peatlands, for example, and about rainforests in particular, as well about the Congo Basin forest. And put all of this in the framework of climate change and the COP26 in Glasgow and biodiversity. Let me remind us all again, it took us 1,000 years to create peatlands in Central Africa, but only 100 years will be enough for us to lose these peat bogs. This means we have to stop this destructive process. So this means in 37 years we will have 2 billion people living in Africa. This means we will be much affected. And I was very interested to see the presentation given by Mr. Professor Hansen, and he says that rainforests still act as carbon sinks. Although he also mentioned that this is only true for 20%. So what can we do in specific in order to protect what we still have? What is the main cause for this loss that we see and that the panelists have mentioned? What can we do? And how can we also focus on fighting poverty and development and the conservation of forests and peatlands? I believe that Gabon presented a very good proposal, and this is the way to go. We have friends in China, for example, who are making proposals to us. We have friends here in Germany, for example, the facilitator. And my last question that I would like to ask, if I may. So these are very important challenges for our countries. Do you have any figures, data? This is a question to Professor Matt Hansen. Do you have any data or figures that show that in the peatland areas in the Congo Basin, this applies to a lot of capacity for the storage of carbon. So 4 years of global emissions. Are there any data and figures that show very specifically in both Congo countries what the development in this region is going to look like in order to help us understand what we need to do in Glasgow when it comes to the financial negotiations? Because it is true, Africa cannot just be responsible all by itself for regulating climate and without receiving any rewards. Thank you. Okay, maybe the question you just raised, maybe you could have a bilateral conversation with Professor Hansen. Maybe you could talk together after our panel discussion, because this is the type of question that we cannot deal with right now here on the panel. And the last question before we come to the responses. Thank you, Christoph Heinrich. I work for the WWF in Germany. Just a quick remark, not a question. The federal government, Germany, and also other governments, if you are listening, I would like to call upon you to do more. We have heard a lot about what is going on, and I would like to remind our own country what has happened just recently. We just had a severe flood that will cost us 30 billion euros for something that happened here at a regional level. Then we pay every single year 1 billion to our farmers. Then because of bark beetle devastation, we pay 1 billion to our foresters. We could now implement measures that would cost us only millions. No, instead we focus on paying billions for the damage that we are causing. But apparently this is all, we are not doing anything against this. When it comes to protected areas and nature conservation, it has to be fair, of course. People have to be involved, and they have to be involved. I work for a nature conservation organization. And this is why I would like to ask the ministers of Ecuador and Gabon. Concepts for a true sustainable use of forests does not just mean not to take out only a certain amount of timber, but it also means that we treat the people living there well. This also is part of valuing our forests. And I think we have not yet spoken enough about this topic. Thank you very much for your question. And I would now like to close this round of questions. And I would now like to hear from you, Ms. Rogan. The first question addressing trade, the topic of fairness, the role of the European Union, then a very specific question regarding FLEGT, the FLEGT program, and what we have to do if there should be further negotiations with the EU, whether the European Court of Justice has a role to play here. Maybe you can give us your point of view on this.
I think as a UK representative, even for the COP presidency, it's not for me to talk about the EU. But what I can say from the UK perspective is that following Brexit, of course, we adopted our own UK timber legislation. And when it comes to the principles of protecting forests, working for equitable trade, and making sure that we have legal and sustainable products, the UK is very committed to working both with producer countries and also with the consumer countries and our other partners. In fact, at this moment, we are working on our environment bill, which will really look at how we maintain a sustainable supply chain going all the way through. And I think it's very important also to look at some of those issues that the Minister from Gabon raised as well about how are we doing that? How will those things work and how will they be implemented? And also making sure that you don't have unexpected consequences of this kind of legislation. It is really, I think, only through having that kind of partnership discussion with the concept of fair and sustainable development that we can manage this. And I just want to add one point there and remind everybody who's listening that 2015 was not only the year that we adopted the Paris Agreement for climate action, but it was also the year of the Sustainable Development Agreement and bringing in the idea of leaving no one behind, which is not only about individuals and communities, but it's also about countries and regions. So when we think about that sustainable development, climate is already integrated very strongly into those sustainable development goals. And I know that when we think about government programming and private sector even now is very much into this, the sustainable development and climate link is really one of the solutions, I believe, to making an equitable way forward. At the same time, it's also the way to look at how we are financing. We cannot have separate silos for financing for climate, for financing for recovery from COVID, for financing for development, and imagine that they are not connected. They are connected. And the way that we work with public investment and private investment together has to look at the way we can have a holistic approach to take forward poverty reduction, access to energy, access to economic and social development, which will help all of our communities in these very sensitive and vulnerable areas to be able to develop themselves in a fair and sustainable way, making a fair and sustainable use of their resources.
Vielen Dank, Frau Rogan. Thank you very much. Ich möchte jetzt die letzten Fragen, die noch...
Thank you very much. The last questions, I would like to ask the question to you, Ms. Dager. Tackling poverty, you already mentioned it in your statement, that this is one of the priorities you have. But of course, the to-dos that you have and how to implement them successfully is another topic. So how can we make sure, this was the last question raised by the WWF representative, how can we make sure that we have an inclusive and sustainable use of our land? Because we need to find a balance here. Maybe you can tell us more about your experience in this area.
Thank you for the question. This is a quite challenge for us as well. I do think also that closing the gaps and part of the thing of a fair deal is also needs to do with fair carbon offset markets. And also talking about, tropical forests that are so rich we also need to include the value of water. We need to include the value of biodiversity. We need to have this look of the ecosystem services, you know, to be really aware of the nature functions and services. We are also being paid $5 per hectare, and that's not fair enough. So I really do appreciate the fact that we can talk about so friendly about it and so, you know, frank, and to look upon the future, because we really need each other. Regarding to the question, we do have some programs about the sustainable use of the forest, because with that in the table, or on the table, we really can talk about, you know, preserving our tropical forests. We do need to unleash the potential of sustainable of our forests. And with that being said, one of our main concerns and one of our main goals is to be able to have healthy and strong supply chain of different products that we can be, or we are the best of the world. And with that being said, besides a fair trade, we really need to look at the markets. That's something that we need to do. You know, we need to turn the world around, because we need to create a new normal. Right now, we, of course, we want to be paid more for, you know, deforestation-free products, women-led products, agroecology, and fair trade, of course. But then what happens with countries that do not have these high income? They do deserve to be able to purchase these kind of products. So we need to create this new normal. We need to create more taxes for products or supply chains that, you know, do finance deforestation. So this is one of the key, and we do have several examples of the sustainable use of our forests.
Frau Sadhguru, wenn wir jetzt...
Thank you, Mrs. Sadhguru. If we had more time, and Mr. Shali, I would like to talk to you about trade politics. However, I think we have to do this in our coffee break. Unfortunately, we don't have time just now, but thank you very much that you brought this topic of trade into the discussion. I would like to come back to Mr. Lee White, because there are still many open questions, inclusion of the local communities, indigenous groups, but also, of course, and you mentioned it, Switzerland is not going to stop producing chocolate. So how can we secure an inclusive and sustainable forestry? This was also one of the questions that we heard from the audience, so that we have good land use, sustainable, successful land use, by including all of these topics we've mentioned here today.
Reply to the question from the screen there and from WWF, or maybe all in one go. Gabon is taking great, investing heavily in sustainability throughout our economy, particularly in the forest. So we're putting in place, actually with the Environmental Investigation Agency, a national traceability system. We can prove that our timber products are carbon positive, so climate positive. If you buy furniture from Gabon, it's carbon positive. We're now working on proving that our forest products are positive for biodiversity. And definitely forest products have to be socially responsible. So in Gabon we don't really have this indigenous term. All our Bantu and Pygmy peoples are considered to be indigenous, if you want to use that word. But forest people, rural people, their interests have to be taken into account in all of this. We're a high ambition coalition country. We're committed to 30% of protected areas on land, 30% in freshwater ecosystems, 30% in the ocean, and we're making good progress on that. And so we're moving to try and demonstrate that not just for climate, but for biodiversity, for human capital, that our management of forests is responsible. If developed countries close their markets to our timber products, and that's happening, there are lobbies against tropical timber. There's no tropical timber in the Olympic Games in Paris in 2024. If you close your markets to our timber, how are we going to save our forests? What should we? What other land use are you going to propose to us to save these forests if we can't make them work for the people of the Gabonese Republic, the people of the Congo Basin, and so we have to have. We have to look each other in the eye across the negotiating table and come up with sensible, equitable policies. Thank you.
Sehr gut, vielen Dank für diesen letzten Appell nochmal, dann auch natürlich die Kaffeepausen zu nutzen für diesen intensiven.
I would also like to call again on you to use the coffee breaks. Unfortunately, we have to stop our discussions here. There are, of course, many open questions remaining, but also with a view to the COP26, I think we will have many more interesting discussions. I would like to thank our panelists. We have to leave the stage, so thank you again. A warm round of applause to every one of you. Thank you so much for being here and for taking part in this discussion. I would like to thank Professor Lee White, Minister of Water, Forest, the Sea and the Environment, Bianca Daga Weiss, Minister of the Environment of Ecuador. So please use the coffee break to continue your discussions. Janet Rogan, COP26 Regional Ambassador. Shamsat Kuro, thank you so much for being here as well, although we could of course have talked a lot more about trade and supply chains. And we still have many open questions. Dr. Shen Yong, Hugo Maria Schali, both are present, so virtual greetings over to you. Hannah Movat of the NGO Fern in Brussels, thank you again for shedding a critical light on what might be wanted politically, but is not maybe often all the times put into practice. So I think I would also like to thank you for all the questions that you had, and then I would also like to thank Mr. Schenk, the director of the Zoological Society of Frankfurt. So again, thank you very much for being here, and of course thank you to our audience as well. Whether you are here in the audience, live in the BMZ or online, and we hope that we can answer further questions at a later point. I will be interested to see what the reactions to this conference are going to be. So you can use social media, you can send us pictures as well, or send us more questions. So if you really would like to have more clarifications, then feel free to send them to us. And therefore, I would like to I look forward to the opportunity to have more discussions here on the stage very soon. We talked a lot about the fair deal, for example, and we talked, for example, as well about what we need to do and who needs to be on board. And of course, all of us want to be on board when it comes to protecting our tropical rainforests. This is the goal that is uniting us. And although we might have different viewpoints at times, but this is also the very reason why you are here today. Yesterday we had the signature on the fair deal, and ministers of Central African countries were here coming together, and they said that they want to take a step forward. And this declaration is not just the work of governments, but it is also the work of a very long progress, or not so long progress, actually a fairly short progress compared to others. So stakeholders from civil society, private business, and other organizations were took part in drafting this declaration. So thank you again for your questions that you put to us on Slido. Thank you so much for being such an active audience. And we are now coming to our first high-level part. And we are now going to focus on how the donors can find a common line and how the many shared visions and architectures that we have of the many different funds and projects, initiatives, etc. And Mr. Schenk mentioned one of these initiatives, how all of this can be coordinated in order to become more efficient. And I look forward to continue this conversation.
Aus den USA.
So we'll talk about how to join forces, pool forces. We have Dr. Hans Bratzka from Norway, the Special Envoy of the Ministry of Climate and Environment from Norway. Then Philippe Lacoste, Director of Sustainable Development Department. And then Dr. Diana Puttmann from the US. So welcome to all of you. Mr. Bratzka, Mr. Lacoste, Ms. Puttmann. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We've heard a lot, we've discussed a lot, we've started many discussions actually, because it's difficult to conclude all the discussions. I'm very pleased that Dr. Hans Bratzka is with us from Norway, the Special Envoy Philippe Lacoste from France, and Dr. Diana Puttmann from the United States. When we look at the common approaches, the common viewpoints on our topic, I'd like to start with you, Mr. Lacoste. Where do you see the joint approaches, joint stances, joint arguments? What is your point of view? Well, thank you. I think that we share the same goals, more or less. That's what we saw this morning. We all understand that we have a shared interest in protecting these tropical forest areas. But then we also need to find ways to cooperate even more effectively. Many initiatives have been mentioned in the Congo Basin Forest, for example, but not only there. And we have to make sure that we take more collaborative efforts. And I feel quite optimistic. I'm quite encouraged because we talked about international solidarity in the French Parliament, then there were the yellow vests, and then there was COVID-19, and I wasn't quite sure what would happen, but the law was adopted unanimously by the French Parliament, highlighting a strong will to tackle two global issues jointly at the global level. And each country in line with its responsibility historically, and also in line with its resources. That's all I can say about it. But we'd like to hear you as well. Dr. Bratzka, your voice from Norway. How do you see the donor architecture? It should all be on a solid foundation. We don't see it wobbling on the way towards achieving the target. What do you think should the priorities be in joining forces?
So thank you so much for that. And I think that I've been working on this issue now for more than a decade, and I think we have come a long way. I would like to say that, although the challenges are immense. But I think the first thing we need to do is to get a common line on what are our challenges and how can we work together to find these solutions that are needed. And let me just point out a few things, since we have a big audience watching us and listening to us today. Rainforests contain more than half of the world's documented species. The rainforests secure millions of livelihoods for indigenous peoples and local communities. A source of fresh water. These forests are critical for the world food production. I think that's very important as we look forward to other fora which will discuss this issue. We have to remember that the Amazon water pump provides water as far as the food belt in the US Midwest. And as Professor Lee White has pointed out, the Congo Basin Forest provides rain to large parts of Africa, including the Sahel belt. And the UN has warned that continued deforestation might bring us to the next pandemic through increased human contact with wildlife. So I would say that over the last decade or so, we have become much more aware of these challenges, and we very well know that if we cannot solve the climate crisis without protecting the tropical forest, and we will not reach the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement without rapid and deep cuts in deforestation. So let me just say what we then did. It might seem a little strange to people that why is Norway so involved in protecting tropical forest? But it was in 2008 that our Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg, decided to do something. So he started the Norwegian International Climate and Forest Initiative, which I represent today, and I was the first director of that initiative, and it has invested $3 billion in efforts to protect tropical forest. That's about 10% of our aid budget. And our parliament has already decided to extend this effort until 2030. So it's a long-term investment by our parliament and by our government. We're active in more than 70 countries, and we focus on large result-based partnerships. Let me also mention the LEAF initiative. It's one large initiative launched together with the United States, the UK, and a group of large private companies in April during President Biden's climate summit. And this initiative, this is an example of how we can work together, not just as governments, but with governments and private business. And it's an innovative initiative which will mobilize significant resources, initially $1 billion, but we are looking to go beyond that, to reward countries that reduce deforestation over the next 5 years. This is one concrete example of how we can coordinate our efforts. And why is it so important to coordinate our efforts? This is about alignment and synergies. It's about learning from each other. It's about complementing each other and avoid duplication. And we are part of several coordination platforms. The most interesting example, since we had a special day on the Congo Basin yesterday, is the Central African Forest Initiative with 7 donors and 6 forest partner countries in Central Africa. And I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Herr Pratzka. Thank you. Wir kommen gleich nochmal zurück. Ich möchte jetzt nur nochmal.
Well, thank you very much. But now I'd like to move over to Ms. Putman before coming back to you, where the United States is back in the boat, as it were, with regard to the issues of forest conservation and forest management. Where do you see the priorities? Now you've rejoined the activities, you're getting back on board here, and where do you see the priorities and what are the activities that you would like to support?
First, and I do want to thank the German government and Minister Mueller and you, Katie, for having the U.S. here. And yes, we are back. Although in many ways we never left, and I think that's also important for people to realize. I'm a long-term development professional, having grown up in Africa, and we're very good at reimagining how we describe many of the things that we do, and so many of the priorities over the years we've been able to maintain with different names. So I say that, but our President Biden has recognized that climate change is probably the #1 issue facing humanity. And he's announced bold new U.S. commitments in terms of reducing our own emissions, but also importantly for this group in terms of increasing the amount of funding we're going to provide. And we plan to double our money going into climate finance to developing countries by 2024. I represent the United States Agency for International Development, again with the group of people, while this is symposium on all tropical forests. We did have a special day on the Congo Basin. I spent 5 years there working on these issues as the USAID mission director there, so I know the challenges very, very closely. Worked, again, with many people in this room, the Norwegians, the UK, the Germans, the French, on these topics. So we have never stopped work on tropical forests. In fact, in 2020 alone, we spent $230 million in forest conservation or management. That was USAID itself, not the entire US government. And with partners, we put in place improved management of forests, 62 million hectares of forests in that year alone. So we continue to do this. We are going to announce a new climate change, very ambitious climate change policy and strategy at COP26 that will be, the US government is working on this across a range of agencies, but USAID will clearly be focusing on the developing world and on tropical forests. And I guess that before I end on this is we are collaborating. We don't always join formally all the different mechanisms that exist out there, particularly some of the multilateral mechanisms just due to various political reasons, but we certainly spend a lot of time coordinating with other donors and not duplicating, and LEAF is a good example, as well as many other activities. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Puttmann. Als Nachrichtenjournalistin bin ich natürlich gespannt. Können Sie...
Well, thank you very much. Maybe you could tell us a bit about the COP26, the priority that you might mention? I'm just curious, like to ask you.
Like many donors here, we are not really in a position to make a lot of announcements ahead of time. We usually have to be fairly careful about that, but we are in close discussion with many donors, and certainly will be an increase in our own investments, both in the U.S. in terms of reducing emissions, increased funding around the world, and also figuring out how we can definitely partner better and more smartly. I think one aspect people tend to forget is the multi-sectoral nature of climate change, and we talk about it, but we also have to remember in terms of funding that across our governments we're investing a lot in sustainable agriculture, in water, in clean energy, and we're certainly going to be promoting more of that. And also the emphasis on working with the private sector and NGOs in order to come up with more equitable practices for indigenous peoples and local communities around the globe. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Puttmann. Dann wären wir schon beim Thema, Herr Pratzka. Ich würde gerne noch mal kurz in der letzten Runde auf Sie zu sprechen.
Mr. Pratzka, in this last round, I'd like to get back to you again. We've been talking a lot, but you also have to manage expectations in a way. And there might also be disappointments in some cases because many promises are being made, but then we don't see sufficient funding maybe for forest protection. And there's also room for improvement with regard to the political will. So this has to be communicated effectively. What do you see in Norway, possibilities to bridge these gaps and divides in terms of expectation management? That's also a question to Mr. Lacoste later.
Thank you. I think that's always a big issue. I mean, we are very active and we have large programs, but we can't be active everywhere. I mean, we have to partners with other donors and, of course, with our countries, the forest countries. But first of all, I'd like to say that, as I said earlier, the discussion, the political discourse has changed very much in the 13 years that I've been working in and out of these issues. I think there's much more understanding now of what the challenges are. And that we need to find the funding for it. And I'm very happy to work with my colleagues up here, but also with many others on these issues. So we have to do more as donors. I mean, that's obvious. As I said earlier, we have a commitment until 2030 so far on the Climate and Forest Initiative. We have used an increasingly large share of our development aid, which has been growing rapidly over the last 15 years or so, on climate issues, and we will continue to do so. There's very broad parliamentary support for that. But we also need to broaden our funding base. The private sector must be much more involved. And I mentioned the LEAF program as an example of how we try to do that, try to mobilize private demand for forest carbon. This is the key. I mean, the governments can never do everything when we talk about the need to meet of financing for forest carbon. We need to work with the private sector, and LEAF is one very current example that we have of that, and I hope that you will continue to look at that. But I should also mention domestic resource mobilization. This is a true partnership. And just as an example on how important that is, we have to remember that for the Millennium Development Goals, almost 80% of the funding for reaching those goals come from domestic funding. So better taxation, we can work. Norway has something called taxation for development. We work with the partners in the south on improving customs and tax collection services. So there are many other things we can do across the world, but domestic funding is an element that we have to remember. As I said, 80% of the Millennium Development Goals were financed by domestic funding. I would guess that for the Sustainable Development Goals, that percentage will be even higher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bratzka, Klimasonderbotschafter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bratzka, Special Envoy for Climate Action. Mr. Lacoste, how would you answer this question? That we can bridge these expectation divides, so to speak, manage expectations. I think it's really the diplomat's job to bring together different opinions. I am of the same opinion as my Norwegian colleague. We don't have sufficient funding, and the countries that we used to call developed countries, industrialized countries, need to strengthen their funding either through initiatives or by providing direct funding or through international partnerships, and France is trying to do that by contributing to the initiative for the forests in Central Africa, CAFI, and they can also play an active role in international conferences, of course, but I don't think that finances all. It's important to remember that donors also need to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of programs and look at scientific monitoring as well. I was very impressed to see the presentation and how to measure impacts. That was quite impressive this morning, and this will also tell us what needs, what requirements have to be met, and I hope that this will help us. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists, Dr. Hans Bratzka, the Special Envoy from Norway, Dr. Dana Putman from the United States, and Philippe Lacoste from France. Thank you very much for being here. And ladies and gentlemen, this brings me to my words of welcome to the Federal Minister of Economic Cooperation and Development, Minister Müller, and Mr. Doré. He's the acting president of COMIFAC, the Forest Commission for Central Africa, and Mr. Doré will start with you. Please join me on the stage for your speech, for your remarks. Thank you.
Voilà, monsieur.
Merci.
Bonjour.
Thank you. Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development of the Federal Government of Germany, Ministers, Excellencies, ambassadors and representatives of diplomatic missions, facilitator, thank you for being here as a representative of the CBFP, President of COMIFAC, representatives of international and sub-regional organizations, guests. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor today to take part in the closing ceremony of the Tropical Forest Symposium. As you may well know, COMIFAC is not an international organization that serves it is an international organization that serves as a reference organization in forestry policy in Central Africa. In the Yaoundé Declaration, we made some first progress, and together it is our ambition to push for the conservation of ecosystems in Central Africa. So today we are a specialized agency and organization that is part of ECAS, the Economic Community of Central African States. I would like to thank the Federal Republic of Germany for being the facilitator of our Congo Basin Forest Partnership, for organizing this symposium today. This shows to us that Germany recognizes the value of our tropical forests for the entire world. The Congo Basin rainforests play a crucial role as they act as carbon sinks, for example. And this is a very important role when it comes to climate change. Global Forest Watch, the organization, and its scientists have shown that these rainforests are a huge treasure for the world, and they can actually capture more carbon than they emit. There are also many important peat bogs and peatlands in this area that also capture a lot of carbon. COMIFAC countries do not just stand for forests, but there are also many protected areas. 18.8% of our area is either forests or protected areas. So these are protected areas. So approximately 18% forests and protected areas, and approximately 11% protected areas, which are also areas that are part of our natural heritage and that are very important biospheres. So this shows how much we are committed to protecting this region in order to reach the NDCs. In Central Africa, we have approximately 24 million hectares of forests. And we also try to engage in reforestation in order to make up for forest degradation. This is, of course, also a big challenge we are facing. Also, this is work we are doing as part of the Bonn Challenge. As of January 2023, the Democratic Republic of the Congo wants to have new strategies, and thereby we can focus more on job creation and create better livelihoods for the population in this region. I am very grateful to the donors who are supporting us in this very important task and work in order to allow for us to provide for sustainable use of these green lungs. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the COMIFAC countries are facing many challenges when it comes to the conservation of this natural world heritage. For example, there are wild animals that are being hunted, although there's a hunting ban. Then we see that there is logging, illegal logging. There are conflicts when it comes to the use of when it comes to land use. And then what might happen as well is that you might be exposed to non-tariff barriers. For example, we heard that the Olympic Games in Paris in 2024 will be organized without importing tropical timber products. We have to think about the internally displaced people as well. These people are displaced because there is more pressure on the natural resources present. This is why we have to change many of the things that we are doing in order to support tropical rainforests. We need to diversify our economies in Africa. For example, we could think about constructive synergies. Just to mention, there could be major agricultural and mining projects that could be looked here in that we have to assess. And let me just mention, a tree is a very valuable thing in nature, and we value those people and countries and COMIFAC who are trying to value trees and forests. There have been many resolutions after many climate COPs, and often many funds were pledged. However, access to this finance is extremely complex and complicated, and only 3% of climate funds are actually addressed to these tropical rainforests. Although actually we need to do a lot more. So prior to this Tropical Forest Symposium, we, the countries, have reinforced our commitment to work for the forests and to protect them. This is something that we did through our declaration that we adopted. Central African countries have thereby assumed the responsibility and have pledged to do more when it comes to global climate governance. We pledge to reduce CO2 emissions, that we will sustainably manage our peatlands, that we will continue to our reforestation strategies in the framework of the Bonn Challenge, and we also think about public-private partnerships when it comes to the management of these forests. We want to continue regional cooperation when it comes to biodiversity and protected areas management. We also want to improve our forest governance. We also want to involve civil society a lot more. And we want to focus more on green economy in order to provide for a sustainable development. Our rainforests are very important also in the social realm, and if they vanished, this would of course affect the regional, local and international community. These forests are a natural heritage and a capital for our sustainable development. And this is why we believe that our region needs to have sufficient financial means and funds, and that the percentage points mentioned earlier should be increased. We believe that access to finance has to become easier. by implementing strategies that take into account the reality in the countries of the global south. The global north cannot say, for example, we want these products and use these products, and we want, and then decide on the access to these products. The international community should also see that there are some factors that have already improved, for example, when it comes to innovative foreign investments, when it comes to renewable energy, for example, processing of timber products and non-timber products. We want to see a harmonization of funds in accordance with the Paris Declaration with regard to the efficiency of development funds. We also want a fair price for our carbon credits. COMIFAC member states, well, these partner states want to increase the cooperation with the Federal Republic of Germany, and in particular, of course, with the BMZ, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and of course as well with the Environment Ministry, with the KfW Development Bank and the GIZ, so that we can actually implement our convergence plan for the benefit of our people. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, I am very grateful, and I know that the other countries are as well, for all the different opportunities that were provided to us in the past years. Let me remind you that on the 15th of June 2020, that we signed an agreement between the federal government of Germany and COMIFAC. This was the second agreement of its kind after we had signed an agreement with the African Union as well. At COMIFAC, we hope for a stronger partnership that will allow for us to tackle the increasing amount of challenges in the area of the conservation and use of these ecosystems in our forests. Let me congratulate Dr. Christian Ruck for all the energy he put into this work, despite the very difficult situation we've been facing with the COVID-19 pandemic, to bring us forward in our discussions and to ensure that we join forces to really manage our forests sustainably. COMIFAC and ministers present hope that they have been able to contribute to us joining forces even more today and putting in more effort than before in order to bring this forward. And I would like to thank again the Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, and I hope that the message we are now sending out here from Berlin, that this message will be received by the countries of the global north, by all countries of the global north, and that everybody will join in this joint effort. Vive the international cooperation, long live international cooperation. Thank you.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Monsieur Doré. And now it gives me great pleasure to welcome the German Development Minister on stage, Gerd Müller. Well, forests are life, tropical forests are life, that's what you said yesterday, with many exclamation marks. Minister Müller, the floor is yours. Well, thank you. We felt the enthusiasm with all of the panelists. It's really a topic that you care about deeply. And I said before, I went to Indonesia, I went to the Congo Basin, I went to the Amazon region, so I had the pleasure of seeing it all for myself. And I think this map is so impressive. It's really the heart or the lung of our planet. The lungs of our planet, these forests. And Minister, you asked the question last night whether policymakers in the field of climate action have they actually understood what it would mean for life on Earth if these forests were to disappear. I think climate politicians may have understood it because you're all experts in this room, but I'm not sure whether the political sphere, whether the political world has actually understood the message, what it would mean if these forests were to disappear, which is why such conferences are so important. We need to share the message, make this message heard by people other than just forest ministers. I think everyone needs to hear this message because tropical forests are the guarantee for survival. I mean, we need them for survival. One of the African ministers said that it's also so important for biodiversity, for hydrological services, for biodiversity for the species, and rainforests will decide on the survival of humankind. Well, not our future maybe, but the future of generations to come. And I'd like to say this once again by looking at this map. We all need to be aware of the importance of not just tropical forests, but also forests in general. A third of land is covered by forests. And I'd also like to mention Russia. It's the country with most forests. 50% of its area is covered by forests. Russia is the largest country in terms of its size, and 50% of its area are covered by land. Not rainforests, obviously, but forests. And these large countries have to get on board for a new Green Deal or Fair Deal in China as well. Let me add, guests from the tropical regions, we also need to look at ourselves, look in the mirror. In Germany, forest areas are growing because we have a forest protection concept and very strict laws. But in the European Union, forest areas are shrinking. So we also need to start with ourselves. The forest ministers and environment ministers from the Congo asked the question last night whether we've really understood, whether all of us have understood what will happen when forests disappear. I don't think they have, but we will use the symposium after the conference and build on it, not just with regard to the run-up to COP26, but also with regard to general European politics. So we will use it to really spread your messages. And last night, people also asked, why did we wait so long for this issue to be addressed on this panel? Why have we waited for so long until we moved it to the very core of the political agenda and debate? Well, we want to move ahead. We really want to put the topic of forest protection, tropical forest protection, on the agenda of international politics. You're doing it. We're doing it. I'd like to thank you for coming. It's so wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much for your very insightful, instructive remarks, and we will document all of them. And Mr. Rook, Christian Rook, thank you personally as well. It's your life's work. I mean, you've been the facilitator for the past 2 years, but you've been working in this area, in German politics and in European politics for decades, and you're really someone who fights with all your energy for protecting forests. And I'm sure he will tell you what the experience was in his childhood that made him want to protect forests. And I visited him once and I encountered snakes. It was quite remarkable, actually. Well, the COP26, COP15 coming up, and we need to adopt a new concept on protecting rainforests. We haven't done enough so far. Only 3% of climate finance is used for your regions. And I know that processes are too bureaucratic. There's too much red tape, this Green Climate Fund, all the mechanisms that we've set up. It's just too cumbersome in terms of administration for your countries. You've made some very specific proposals. I don't want to repeat them again. We just have to take up your proposals and implement them, and the world needs to understand that your regions provide essential ecosystem services. Forests provide so important ecosystem services. The WWF is here too. So these services are essential for humankind, for our planet, and they need a price tag. 1.5 degrees, well, the 2 degrees Celsius target, these targets can only be achieved by stepping up our efforts in the field of forest conservation. We will fail this goal by far if we continue our business as usual. What we're doing right now is simply not enough. The Paris Agreement with the reduction targets, well, I think only 6 or 8 countries are doing well. We're really far away from reaching the 2-degree target. We're not just talking about reduction of emissions, we're also talking about preserving the absorption capacity of the planet. Peatlands, the rainforests, marine protection, of course, plays an important role, protecting our oceans. It's not really the focus of our debate today, but this also has to play a central role and be given more importance at the upcoming conferences. So these vital ecosystem services come with a price. We talked about negative emissions last night. Your countries also carry the historic burden. Well, we, the industrialized states, have emitted greenhouse gases, and we in Europe are still at 8.10 tons per capita. China and other countries have seen dynamic growth in their budgets for the next years, for the next decades. So you're negative emitters, and we have to reward that. And when I visited the tropical rainforests in Africa with Christian Ruck, I saw it for myself. And Minister, you said it before, the people there, they live with the forest and from the forest. There are many millions of people were affected, and we can deliver endless speeches, but people need work. They have to be able to feed themselves and then need an income. And they've been living with and from the forest for centuries. And if you introduce and implement protection concepts, these stakeholders need to get involved. They have to be involved in drafting these strategies, and they also need to benefit from them in terms of energy, food, water, work. And we need investments on the ground. It was also addressed last night. Value chains on the ground in the regions, because these regions are not just rich in timber, but also in minerals, in resources. The Congo, for example, no mobile phone in Germany works without your resources. I went to the International Automotive Exhibition a few days ago. No car can do without your resources, your valuable resources, which is why you, the countries, that have these resources, well, you need to be paid a fair price. We have to stop exploitation of nature and humans in your countries by creating value chains locally. We need to create value locally. I'm not proud, that wouldn't be the right term really, but we need to act. And I'm pleased to say that Germany has adopted a supply chain law. It took us 6 years of controversial debates. We had to really fight hard for this law, and we've also presented it to the European Union. I talked to the new WTO director a few days ago. We need to find new fair models to allow people on the ground to benefit much more from supply chains. And then we can lead an entirely different discussion on stopping deforestation, because people on the ground will then have an income, they will have jobs. So we need to understand that forests provide so important services. We need a global forest agreement. The new fair deal reminds me too much of the former US president. We don't need such deals. We need a fair deal. We need a fair deal for forests of the international community. What does it mean, ladies and gentlemen? You've explained many things. You've provided valuable information. We will build on that and then introduce your insights into the upcoming debates. More funding. So we need more funding for protecting tropical forests. We also need to create new incentives. So protecting forests needs to be something that is worthwhile, that pays off. And we also need ownership. You, the ministers, will have to take ownership. So the people on the ground, policymakers in your countries, have to understand that it's about your future. That's the only way for us to be successful. We can't tell you that. We won't be able to achieve success as you're the ones who take the decisions in the countries, in the regions, and we need clear rules. I said it before. We need clear rules for consumption, for global trade. We need to step up our investments. We have to mobilize the required funding in Glasgow, not just public finance. We do have this 100 billion pledge made by the international community, and this pledge has not been honored yet. I don't know if any media representatives are present or are listening. I want to do some research. Well, I went to a UN conference together with the German Chancellor, and these questions were addressed at this conference. Germany has delivered on its commitments, and we will increase climate finance from 4 billion, and we will create further incentives. Since 2015, our ministry alone, you might say it's not enough, but we've really made this a priority. So we've invested 2 billion euros into forest protection through many, many programs. And if we were to multiply this figure by 27, all the member states of the European Union, and if Brussels were to make this a priority too, the Green Deal, the climate action program of the European Union, so if Brussels were to understand finally that we can't save the global climate just in Europe or in Germany, but that we need an African pillar and also a forest pillar for international forest protection, then this will be so helpful. Gabon, Ecuador, Indonesia. I think that the Indonesian ambassador is present this morning. So we are working very closely with Indonesia and with many other countries as well. And then trade is an important factor. Investments have to protect forests worldwide. And the EU needs to lead the way. This morning I talked with our Federal Minister for Agriculture. She supports me in our endeavors. We're importing deforestation right now. We're importing deforestation. Industrialized countries, Germany, Europe. Well, what do we do in the morning? We get up, then we wash our hair, What is in our shampoo? Palm oil. And to produce this palm oil in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, not everywhere, but in many areas, forests are burning because of this palm oil. And I could go on. Soybean production in Brazil, in the Amazon region. We're importing soy as feedstuffs for our cattle so we can eat meat. And we have to stop this vicious circle so that our prosperity depends on burning tropical forests, which is why we will need an EU-wide policy. I mean, it will come, I'm sure. We've been working for it for years. We'll have an EU-wide regulation for deforestation-free supply chains. And the EU Commission will present a proposal this year. And you're at the start of supply chains, and this will benefit you. And we will need to work on this together. How can we manage palm oil production? How can we manage soy procurement? What can we do for Brazilian farmers? It's always a question that needs to be resolved locally with the people who are affected, with the farmers. Deforestation-free supply chains are essential. We don't want any rainforests to burn for our products that we use every day. 11% of CO2 emissions of our planet are caused by burning rainforests. Just imagine that, 11% of emissions. Germany emits 2%, has a 2% share of global CO2 emissions, but 11%, that's 5 or 6 times that share. That's the burning tropical rainforests and the resulting CO2 emissions. And forest protection needs a price tag, and we need to negotiate that with the WTO within a global trade system, global trade scheme. We need to act now, ladies and gentlemen. In the run-up to the climate COP in Glasgow, we need to present a clear proposal, especially a new financing concept, and here industrialized countries need to commit themselves, make more commitments than they did in the past. And I'd like to thank you very much for your support today and also over the past decades. I'd also like to thank my European colleagues, France, the UK. Thank you very much also to the United States. Thank you to Norway. Well, unfortunately, if I may say so, Norway is still hesitant. Mr. Ambassador, I hope that I may say so. The Amazon Fund to protect the rainforest is something that we want to keep up doing, keep up supporting, regardless of the government there, whether we like it or not. It doesn't help if we stop providing funding. It won't help the forests, it won't help the people on the ground, it won't help the climate. So please let us continue with the fund. Let us work with the people in the forests, the local population. Let us move ahead with these programs. I'd also like to mention the Red Early Movers program. We're very committed, working with partners from the European Union. And I'd also like to emphasize that we are working with China as well. You all know that Chinese companies, Chinese partners are so important for you, for your countries. We're aware of that too. And we're in very constructive talks with our Chinese partners, with the Chinese government, in order to conserve your forests. My ministry is working with China and with African partners to launch a joint initiative for sustainability and legality in timber trade. Certified timber trade with the Chinese. This would help you make major headway in your countries. This will really mean great progress for your countries. And we need China as a partner because the Chinese have the largest demand market, of course. They have the largest share in international timber trade. That is why we are supporting them. They're supporting us. And last night, yesterday I signed an agreement with the Congo Basin Forest Partnership. Thank you very much. And it's always important to have such events because you can then exchange experiences, exchange views, and it's also an interesting and very rewarding process drafting up such a declaration because it meant that you engaged in a very close exchange and close collaboration, 10 countries, and we really want to reward such commitments and such work. And I'm happy to announce that this ministry will provide an additional 125 million euros for coffee. So that's an announcement I'm happy to make today, an additional 125 million euros for coffee provided by my ministry. And I'm not just interested in smoke and mirrors and speeches. I really want to be very specific and concrete. I'd like to see a zero instead of 125, 1,250. I'm working on that with our finance minister. And the Amazon initiative is also very important. And we've launched a very interesting project also at the proposal of Mr. Rook, the Legacy Landscape Fund. The Chancellor has given us a target, so 30% of all oceans and land should become protected areas, and the Legacy Landscape Fund gives us an opportunity to provide long-term funding for special protected areas. It is a foundation or a fund under public law, but policy makers cannot influence it. It will be independent and it will work with private investors and provide long-term finance for protected areas. It's a completely new approach. Public money alone will not be sufficient to resolve all the big issues on this planet. We need trade, we need value creation, value chains, and we also need private sector investment. There's so many rich people in the world. Jeff Bezos is one of them. I think his wealth has grown by $60 billion. What does he do with all this money? Then Amazon, well, Elon Musk is, well, 60, 80, 100 billion dollars more in wealth. And Amazon, once again, 60 billion that he gained in wealth with Amazon. I mean, if you could just get 20 billion out of these 60 billion, that would be very helpful. And I'm saying that particularly with regard to Amazon, because our trade systems need to be changed. Online trade, e-commerce really is responsible for a lot of CO2 emissions, accounts for a high share of climate impact, and I think that's why he in particular should invest in forest protection measures. He will get a green badge from us if he does so. Ladies and gentlemen, I also believe that the billionaires that really benefit so immensely from globalizations, the 10 richest men, it's only men, by the way, not a woman yet. No, I think the widow, no, it's not the widow, the ex-wife of Jeff Bezos, she's one of them, but apart from that, that's 9 men. They own as much as half of all poor people on this planet. Just imagine that. So their wealth corresponds the wealth of all, well, half of the world's poor combined. But if we can win them over for our goals, Bill Gates is one of the big and great philanthropists who has also been here with us, and he's very active in the field of health, fight against COVID, for example, where there's so many things that we need to tackle jointly. There's so much we still need to do, and I think this symposium has really given us strength, encouraged us to work even more closely together, and I'd like to thank all of you. I'd like to thank the guests, the speakers, the ministers. Thank you so much for traveling so far here to Germany, to Berlin, and also a great big thank you to Christian Ruck, to the European friends. I greatly appreciate you being here, Norway, the UK, France, the United States. It's so wonderful that you're sending out this very important message together with us. And I'd also like to thank everyone at our ministry who worked so hard to make this happen in this format, despite resistance in these pandemic times. After 1.5 years, it's the first major event that we can actually host here at the ministry. You can, of course, have online conferences, but it's always better to meet in person. Thank you. Thank you very much to the German Development Minister, Dr. Gerd Müller. This brings us to the end of our 3-hour live stream on this very important topic. Thank you very much for watching, for being part of this Tropical Forest Symposium. And we want to strengthen our green lungs, we want to protect them. All the best to you. We'll meet again at the COP, and then we'll continue our discussions there. All the best for you. Stay safe. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you very much for your questions. See you soon.